the war between Russia and Ukraine has captured the world's attention, not merely as a military conflict but as a symbol of deeper tensions rooted in identity, power, and history. To understand this modern tragedy, we must journey back through the centuries, exploring the complex web of religion, ethnicity, imperial ambition, cultural memory, and geopolitical struggle that stretches from the ancient steppes of Kievan Rus to the blood-soaked soil of Donbas. This is not just a tale of two nations, it is the story of how history echoes in language, religion, and war, and how wounds left unattended can span generations. In this 40-part exploration, we dive beneath the headlines to uncover what brought us here, and what history whispers about where we might be going. Part 1. The Cradle of the Rus, the birth of Eastern Slavic civilization. Before there were borders, before there were presidents and pipelines and proxy wars, there was a river, a wide and winding silver artery called the Dnipro. Its waters carried more than fish and silt. They carried memory, myth, and migration. Along its banks, in the mists of the 9th century, a people began to gather. Slavic tribes, traders from Scandinavia, nomads from the steppe. From this convergence, half accidental, half ordained by history, emerged the first echoes of a civilization that would later be claimed by both Russia and Ukraine, the Kyivan Rus. In the dark forests and open plains of what we now call Eastern Europe, life was harsh but vivid. Wooden forts dotted the landscape, simple but sturdy, and villages clung close to rivers for sustenance and safety. The people farmed, fished, and worshipped gods who whispered through the wind in the trees: Purin, the thunder god; Dazbog, the giver of the sun. They traded furs and honey with the Byzantines, learning from them the value of gold and silk, and perhaps more importantly, the power of writing, religion, and rule. The rise of Kiev, then just a hilltop settlement with timber walls and smoke curling from thatched roofs, was swift and strange. The tale passed down, though shaped by legend, tells of a Varangian prince named Rurik, who established order in Novgorod, and whose kin eventually descended the Dnipro to build something new. Kiev, under the hands of his successors, became not just a city, but a center, a beacon that drew peoples together under a loose but growing federation. This was the Kyivan Rus, not yet a kingdom, not yet an empire, but the fragile bones of something that would endure and fracture and echo across the ages. By the time Prince Oleg nailed his shield to the gates of Constantinople in the early 900s, the Rus had become a name of consequence. Their longboats, carved like dragons and swift on the rivers, brought both fear and commerce to the great empires of the south. They were raiders and diplomats, warriors and traders. But more than that, they were forming a shared sense of self, however faint, through language, law, and lineage. Still, it was not unity but survival that defined the Kyivan Rus. Power flowed through bloodlines, but those bloodlines often spilled. Succession was a gamble, and brothers warred as often as they ruled together. The princes of Kiev, Novgorod, and later Vladimir all tugged at the reins of the realm, each carving his legacy into the stone of history. But amidst this chaos, something remarkable took root, an identity rooted in place, shaped by hardship, and bound together by the stories they told. Religion, too, would soon weave its way into the fabric of Rus life. But in these earliest centuries, faith still clung to the old gods. Bonfires crackled during solstice rites, and stone idols watched silently from groves. The Christian cross had not yet cast its long shadow, but it was coming. So often, modern maps lie by what they leave out. They do not show the drift of peoples, the merging of bloodlines, the way the Dnipro once bore men who would be remembered in both Russian and Ukrainian chronicles as founders, as kin. They do not show how the same names, Volodymyr, Yerepok, Oleg, could belong to the shared history of two nations now at war. Because back then, there were no such names as Russia or Ukraine. There was only Rus, a world still being built. To understand the pain of the present, we must hear the heartbeat of this distant past. Before it was a battleground, this land was a cradle. Before it was contested, it was shared. And before the words brother and enemy became interchangeable, there was only the river, and the people who dared to follow its flow into the unknown. Part 2, Kyivan Rus and the Rise of Orthodoxy. As the sun crept across the domes of the Byzantine Empire, casting golden light on the spires of Constantinople. Its influence stretched northward, quiet but steady, like a tide. It came not with swords but with scripture, not with soldiers but with scribes, bearing crosses, icons, and words in a language foreign yet hauntingly familiar. To the princes of the Kievan Rus, Byzantium was not just a neighbor, it was a mirror of power, sophistication, and divine sanction. And soon, its religion would become theirs. By the late 10th century, Kiev was no longer a remote outpost, it was a capital of consequence. Its wooden palisades had given way to stone churches and markets bustling with goods from as far as Baghdad and the Baltic. The realm was not yet a kingdom in the Western sense, but it was a federation with a beating heart, and that heart belonged to Volodymyr the Great. Volodymyr, sometimes called Vladimir, depending on the tongue, was a prince of contradictions. Brutal and pragmatic, charismatic and cunning, he ruled not only with a sword but with an eye toward legacy. The old gods had served his people well in times of chaos, but now he sought something more enduring, something that could bind his realm not just by blood and battle, but by belief. The chronicles tell us a tale that borders on parable, how Volodymyr sent envoys to study the religions of the world, Islam in the east, Judaism among the Khazars, Catholicism in the west. But it was Orthodoxy in Byzantium that struck a chord. His envoys, upon witnessing the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia, declared that they no longer knew whether they were in heaven or on earth. Whether this story is myth or history hardly matters, for what followed was real. In 988 CE, Volodymyr accepted Christianity from Constantinople and began the wholesale baptism of his people in the Dnipro River. It was not a smooth transition. Pagan shrines were torn down. Wooden idols of Purin were cast into the river. But belief does not change as swiftly as law. For years, perhaps generations, Orthodoxy sat uneasily atop older ways. Yet slowly, surely, the rhythms of Byzantine Christianity reshaped Rus society. Monasteries sprouted on hillsides. Priests took the place of shamans. And most importantly, a new script, Cyrillic, began to spread, enabling the written word to root in the soil of the Slavic world. With this faith came art. Icons bloomed like visions in the candlelight, faces of saints with solemn eyes and golden halos. Frescoes adorned new churches, and chants echoed through stone halls, binding the people in shared liturgy and sacred time. Religion had become a new architecture for identity, stretching across the river towns and forested valleys. But this adoption of orthodoxy did more than sanctify the soul, it bound Kievan Rus to Byzantium in a political and cultural embrace. Marriages between royal houses deepened the connection. Trade increased, embassies flourished. And over time, the idea took root that Rus was more than a collection of principalities. It was a people chosen, sanctified, drawn into the great Christian narrative. For the Ukrainian and Russian identities that would later emerge, this moment was pivotal. Orthodoxy became a shared spiritual inheritance, one claimed with equal fervor by both. Kiev, with its new churches and growing influence, was seen as the cradle of faith. Even centuries later, when Moscow would rise and proclaim itself the Third Rome, it would look backward to this moment as the source of its legitimacy. Yet here, too, the seeds of future division were buried alongside the saints. For in adopting a religion so closely tied to an empire, Kievan Rus also inherited the fragility of empire. The unity of the faith did not guarantee the unity of the people. As generations passed, the power of Kiev waned, and the principalities began to splinter. Still, for a brief and shining era, the Rus lived in the warmth of a common light. Crosses were carved in wood and stone. Bells called the faithful to prayer. And amid the chants and incense, a civilization began to see itself not only as a power of the steppe, but as part of a divine order that stretched across continents. This faith, born of water and will, would endure beyond kingdoms, conquerors, and cathedrals. It would outlast Mongol invasions, communist revolutions, and modern warfare. And it would continue to shape the hearts of nations who still, centuries later, argue not only about borders, but about who carries the true legacy of the baptized Rus. Part 3, Fragmentation and Mongol Shadows, the Rupture of Rus Unity. The golden days of Kievan Rus glowed briefly, like candlelight in a wind-blown cathedral, before being scattered by the storms of ambition, geography, and fate. The unity forged under Volodymyr and his heirs was not built to last the long centuries. It cracked under the weight of succession rivalries, local loyalties, and the vast distances that separated the great river cities from the forested hinterlands. From that fracturing arose a chorus of competing voices, each calling itself Rus, each laying claim to the mantle of the sacred flame, but none able to hold it alone. By the 12th century, the once unified realm had become a tapestry of princely fiefdoms: Kiev, Novgorod, Vladimir Suzdal, Halych, and others, each ruled by descendants of the same dynasty but bound more by bloodline than shared purpose. The old dream of a single Rus now splintered into regional ambitions. Brothers turned against brothers, alliances shifted with the seasons, and the authority of Kiev, once the heart of orthodoxy and power, withered with time. This decentralization was not merely political, it was cultural. While the people of Rus still prayed in the same churches and honored the same saints, their accents, customs, and even their architecture began to diverge. The northern forests birthed a colder, harder style of rule, one more hierarchical and inward-looking. The southern steppes remained open and cosmopolitan, influenced by trade and proximity to Byzantium and Central Europe. These distinctions, at first subtle, would later form the backbone of modern Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian identities. And then came the thunder from the east. It arrived not as a whisper but as a roar, hoofbeats and smoke, banners and death. The Mongols, under the banner of the Golden Horde, swept westward with unrelenting fury, bringing with them not only conquest but the crushing weight of tribute, servitude, and broken pride. In 1237, they descended upon the principalities one by one, like fire consuming dry grass. Ryazan fell. Vladimir burned. Kiev, once the jewel of Rus, was devastated in 1240, its churches reduced to smoldering ruins, its people massacred or enslaved. The bells that once sang the liturgy now lay buried beneath ash. The Mongols did not settle in these lands, but they did not need to. Their rule was exacted through fear and taxation. The princes who survived learned to kneel, to carry tribute to Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, and to accept that their authority now flowed through a foreign Khan. The very term Grand Prince began to mean not one anointed by God or crowned in Kiev, but one recognized by Mongol decree. But amid the devastation, a shift began, subtle at first, then profound. In the forests of the northeast, the Principality of Moscow, once a minor outpost, began to rise. Its leaders were astute, often willing collaborators with the Mongols, securing favor and relative autonomy by ensuring regular tribute. Over time, Moscow became the intermediary between the Khans and the other Rus principalities. Its wealth grew, its influence expanded, and it began to present itself as the true heir of the Rus legacy. Meanwhile, the western and southern lands of Rus, particularly in modern-day Ukraine, fell under different orbits. Halych and Volhynia looked toward Poland and Hungary. Novgorod leaned toward the Baltic. Kiev, gutted and diminished, struggled to retain its spiritual centrality. The once common Rus identity was now frayed, reshaped by geography and foreign masters. Yet the Mongol yoke did not erase the memory of what had been. It lingered in the liturgy, in the chronicles, in the dreams of restoration whispered in monasteries and princely courts. But those dreams now diverged, some looked to reunite the lands under a powerful czar, others sought autonomy or alignment with the Latin West. The unity of Rus had become a memory, and memories, in time, become battlegrounds. In the centuries that followed, the Mongols would wane, and new powers would rise to fill the vacuum they left behind. But the scars they carved into the land remained. The trauma of invasion, the humiliation of tribute, and the reshuffling of power created the tectonic shifts from which modern Eastern Europe would eventually emerge. And thus, from the smoke and ashes of a shattered realm, competing visions of identity began to take root. Each would lay claim to history, to faith, to destiny. And each would point back, not just to glory, but to loss. Part 4, Lithuania, Poland, and the Western embrace, Ukraine's shifting borders and loyalties. As the eastern half of the old Rus world fell under the watchful eye of the Mongol Khans and the rising ambition of Moscow, the western lands moved to a different rhythm, one shaped not by steppe empires, but by the political tides of Europe. Here, between the Carpathians and the Dnieper, the territories that now make up much of modern Ukraine began to slide gradually into the orbit of Lithuania and Poland, drawn by proximity, shared enemies, and the allure of Western feudal stability. It was in these centuries that the dual pull on Ukrainian identity, East and West, Orthodox and Catholic, steppe and forest, grew more pronounced, threading complexity deep into its cultural DNA. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, once a Baltic pagan power, expanded rapidly south and east in the 14th century, taking advantage of the weakened Mongol grip and fractured Rus principalities. It absorbed vast swaths of land, including Kiev, Chernobyl, and Volhynia. Yet rather than impose a cultural erasure, the Lithuanians largely preserved the Orthodox religion, the Ruthenian language, an ancestor of modern Ukrainian and Belarusian, and the local nobility's rights. For many Ukrainians, though the term did not yet exist in national form, this was a period of relative autonomy and cultural preservation under foreign but tolerant rule. But Lithuania was not alone in its ambition. To the west, the Kingdom of Poland, a rising Catholic power, saw both alliance and opportunity in its eastern neighbor. The Union of Kyiv in 1385, and later the Union of Lublin in 1569, would draw Poland and Lithuania together into a vast commonwealth, one of Europe's largest and most multi-ethnic states. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was, in theory, a noble republic, with checks on royal power and a flowering of cultural life. Yet for the Ruthenian lands, modern Ukraine, this new union also brought tension, especially as Polish Catholic nobles gained lands and influence in Orthodox territories. Over time, the divide deepened. The Polish nobility increasingly pressed for Catholicization and Polonization, encouraging conversions and importing Latin clergy into traditionally Orthodox regions. The Union of Brest in 1596, which sought to bring segments of the Orthodox Church into communion with Rome while maintaining Eastern rites, became both a religious compromise and a cultural flashpoint. While some accepted the new Greek Catholic, Uniate, Church, others saw it as betrayal, fueling resentment and sharpening the boundaries of identity. Orthodox clergy and peasantry often found themselves squeezed between the aspirations of a distant Rome and the administrative reality of a Polish state that favored its own. Yet it would be a mistake to see this era only through the lens of domination. The cities of western Ukraine, Lviv, Kamyanets-Podilskyi, and others, became vibrant cultural hubs, where Armenian merchants, Jewish scholars, Catholic nobles, and Orthodox artisans lived in close and often productive proximity. It was a region of hybridization, where languages mixed and markets and customs layered upon one another. But it was also a region on edge, where local grievances simmered beneath the surface of uneasy coexistence. Amid this environment, the seeds of rebellion were planted, not only against Polish rule, but also against social and religious hierarchies. The Orthodox Cossacks, descendants of runaway serfs, minor nobles, and adventurers living along the Dnipro River's wild frontiers, began to assert themselves as protectors of faith and defenders of local autonomy. Their military prowess and fierce independence would soon make them both a threat and a political force. The 15th and 16th centuries were, for the lands of Ukraine, a time of shifting loyalties and layered identities. The people spoke Ruthenian, worshipped in Orthodox churches, paid taxes to Polish lords, served in Lithuanian courts, and sometimes prayed under Rome's blessing. Boundaries on maps shifted frequently, but deeper than borders was the tension in the soul of a people caught between two worlds, never fully east, never wholly west. In these crucibles, the Ukrainian idea began to take shape, not yet a modern nationalism, but an awareness of distinctiveness born from survival. The memory of Kiev, the pressure from Rome, the freedom of the steppe, all mingled into a cultural undercurrent that would soon rise in the Cossack revolts to come. Part 5, Cossack Uprising and the Khmelnytsky Revolt, Identity Forged in Fire. The windswept steppes of the Dnipro Basin had long offered refuge to those seeking freedom from the grinding demands of landlords, kings, and foreign rule. By the early 17th century, these frontiers had become home to a burgeoning class of free warriors, the Cossacks. These were not just fighters, they were a brotherhood shaped by hardship and liberty, by orthodox faith and martial tradition. They lived on the fringes of empires, yet increasingly found themselves drawn into the heart of geopolitical struggle. And it was in this cauldron of tension, oppression, and hope that one of the most defining events in Ukrainian history would erupt, the Khmelnytsky Uprising of 1648. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a minor noble and experienced military leader, had long simmered with resentment. His personal grievances against a powerful Polish magnate, who had seized his estate and humiliated him, were only the final spark in a powder keg of deeper frustrations. For decades, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had sought to contain and control the Cossacks. Their privileges were curtailed, their Orthodox faith marginalized, and their calls for recognition dismissed. Meanwhile, Ukrainian peasants bore the weight of economic exploitation, religious pressure, and ethnic disdain from the dominant Polish elite. The Commonwealth may have styled itself a republic of nobles, but for the millions of Ruthenians living under its rule, it was a regime of growing exclusion. Khmelnytsky's uprising began with thunderous momentum. Rallying not only the Cossacks but also Orthodox peasants, townspeople, and even disaffected nobles, he unleashed a campaign that was both nationalist and religious, social and political. His early victories sent shockwaves through the Commonwealth. Polish armies were routed, magnates fled, and entire provinces fell under Cossack control. For the first time, there was a glimpse, however fleeting, of a Ruthenian state led by its own sons. But the revolt was not merely a war of liberation. It was a reckoning. The violence unleashed during these years was brutal and chaotic. Jewish communities, often seen as aligned with Polish landlords due to their roles as tax collectors and estate managers, suffered horrific pogroms. Catholics were targeted in retaliatory waves of religious fury. Old grievances exploded into cycles of bloodshed that would leave deep scars on the memory of all peoples in the region. Khmelnytsky envisioned a Cossack-led order within the old Ruthenian heartland, one loyal to Orthodoxy and free from Polish domination. Yet he soon found that independence in such a contested land was a dream difficult to sustain. Seeking allies, he turned first to the Crimean Tatars, longtime enemies, but expedient partners. That alliance proved unstable, as the Tatars pursued their own agendas, often abandoning battles or raiding Ukrainian lands. Realizing the limits of this arrangement, Khmelnytsky then turned to the rising power in the north, Muscovy. The 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav marked a dramatic pivot. In exchange for military protection, Khmelnytsky pledged allegiance to the Tsar. What he hoped would be a loose partnership with a fellow Orthodox power gradually became something else entirely, the first thread in a long and tangled bond between Ukraine and Russia. While it offered short-term salvation from Polish reprisals, the alignment with Moscow opened the door to future domination. The uprising changed everything. Though the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would regain some territories and attempt to reassert control, its grip had been permanently loosened. The Cossack Hetmanate, an autonomous, semi-military polity, emerged as a new actor in Eastern Europe. It was not a modern nation-state, but it gave institutional form to a distinctly Ukrainian identity rooted in orthodoxy, language, memory, and martial pride. More than anything, the Khmelnytsky uprising etched a sense of collective self into the consciousness of the Ruthenian people. The lines between peasant and noble, soldier and monk, had blurred in the fires of revolution. Though the years ahead would be filled with betrayals, partitions, and foreign rule, the memory of this uprising, both its hope and its heartbreak, would endure as a foundational moment in the shaping of Ukrainian identity. Part 6. Between Empires, Ukraine and the Crosswinds of Russia and Poland. As the fires of the Khmelnytsky uprising cooled and the Treaty of Pereyaslav tethered the Cossack Hetmanate to Muscovy, Ukraine found itself straddling two worlds, geographically, culturally, and politically. This fragile alignment with Russia was never a wholehearted embrace, nor was the Polish influence easily erased. Instead, Ukraine became a contested space between empires, caught in the grinding tension of ambition and loyalty, faith and sovereignty, autonomy and annexation. Following Khmelnytsky's death in 1657, the Hetmanate spiraled into a chaotic period known as the Ruin, a time of civil war, foreign occupation, and crumbling unity. Without a strong central figure, the Cossack elite split between those favoring continued alignment with Russia and others looking westward to Poland, or even southward to the Ottoman Empire, for protection. The fractured allegiances created rival hetmans, overlapping claims of authority, and a series of betrayals and counter-betrayals that drained the Cossack state of its original energy. Russia, meanwhile, saw opportunity in the disarray. Under the Tsars, Moscow moved from protector to manipulator, slowly tightening its grip over the hetmanate. What had been sold as brotherhood between Orthodox peoples morphed into a creeping imperial embrace. Ukrainian autonomy, once symbolized by the Democratic Cossack Council, the Rada, was gradually replaced by imperial decrees from faraway St. Petersburg. The hetman's authority became subject to Russian approval, and eventually the office was abolished altogether in 1764 by Catherine the Great. Yet the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was no gentler in its approach. In the western regions of Ukraine, particularly Galicia and Volhynia, Poland retained control throughout much of this period. The Uniats, Orthodox Christians who accepted the authority of the Pope while maintaining Eastern rites, were used by the Commonwealth as a religious bridge between Catholic rule and the local population. But this only deepened tensions, as many Ukrainians saw the Uniate Church as a tool of Polonization. The Polish nobility, often absentee landlords, viewed the Ukrainian peasantry as little more than a labor force to be taxed and disciplined. By the late 18th century, the fate of Ukraine was no longer in the hands of Ukrainians. The partitioning of Poland between Russia, Prussia, and Austria dramatically redrew the map. Eastern and central Ukraine fell fully under Russian control, while western Ukraine became a province of the Habsburg Empire. Ukraine was not just divided by empires, it was divided by laws, languages, education systems, and religions. The steppe was ruled from Moscow, the Carpathians from Vienna, and yet the people who tilled the land or prayed in the wooden churches still spoke the same dialects, sang the same folk songs, and clung to the same stories of Cossack heroism and Orthodox piety. In the east, the Russian Empire pushed hard for assimilation. Ukrainian language and literature were suppressed, dismissed as Little Russian dialects unworthy of cultivation. Orthodox faith was co-opted into the Russian Imperial Church, and cultural life was increasingly subject to censorship and control. Yet resistance simmered quietly, in poetry, in peasant traditions, and in the stubborn memory of a time when Cossacks ruled themselves. In the West, the Habsburgs took a different approach. Austro-Hungarian rule allowed for somewhat greater cultural and linguistic freedom, especially in Galicia. Here, a nascent Ukrainian national movement began to take root, with newspapers, schools, and clergy promoting a distinct Ukrainian identity separate from both Poles and Russians. These seeds would blossom into full political awakening in the decades to come. Thus, between the Russian hammer and the Polish anvil, Ukraine endured. It was a land torn and stitched, ruled and forgotten, courted and betrayed. But in the cracks of empire, identity did not vanish, it deepened. The memory of a free hetmanate, the rhythms of Orthodox prayer, the quiet stories passed from babushka to child, these formed the sinews of a people learning not just to survive occupation, but to remember who they were in spite of it. Part 7, The Awakening, Ukrainian Nationalism and the 19th Century Revival. The 19th century, that long age of empires and revolutions, did not grant Ukraine independence, but it gave birth to something equally powerful, consciousness. Beneath the weight of imperial suppression, amid fields worked by peasants in cities where Ukrainian was forbidden in schools, a quiet reawakening stirred. It began in scattered villages and monasteries, in poetry and song, and it took root in the minds of a generation that refused to forget. In Russian-controlled Ukraine, identity had been pressed into silence. The Russian Empire dismissed Ukrainians as Little Russians, a people without a distinct culture or language, merely a rustic offshoot of the imperial whole. Edicts banned the printing of Ukrainian books, closed down cultural societies, and strictly limited the use of the Ukrainian language in education. The infamous Valuev Circular of 1863 and the EMS Ukase of 1876 were not mere bureaucratic dictates, they were cultural suffocations. The goal was clear: to erase Ukraine by absorption. And yet, even under this heavy hand, voices emerged. Taras Shevchenko, born a serf and freed by benefactors who recognized his genius, became a prophet of Ukrainian nationhood. His poetry, written in Ukrainian, weaved the sufferings of his people into verses of resistance and longing. In his lines, the Dnipro River was no longer just a geographical landmark, it was the soul of a nation. His work was banned, his person exiled, but his words lived on, passed secretly between hands, whispered in classrooms, recited in candlelit homes. To speak Shevchenko's verses aloud was an act of rebellion, to believe in them, an act of faith. Beyond Shevchenko, a constellation of thinkers, writers, and folklorists dedicated themselves to preserving what was being erased. They collected folk songs and tales, recorded customs, and documented the grammar and structure of the Ukrainian language. Figures like Panteleimon Kulish and Mikhailo Drahomanov argued passionately that Ukraine was not merely a province, but a distinct people with a history of its own. Some saw salvation in federalism within the Russian Empire, others dreamed of independence. All felt the pressure of time, that if the soul of Ukraine were not preserved now, it might never be recovered. Meanwhile, in Austrian-controlled Galicia, the story was different. Though by no means free from prejudice or restriction, the Habsburg Empire allowed greater latitude for cultural development. Here, Ukrainian language schools were allowed to operate, newspapers were published, and political societies formed. The rise of Ruthenian nationalism, an early form of Ukrainian identity, found fertile ground in Lviv and the surrounding countryside. It was here that Ukrainian intellectuals began to articulate what their counterparts in the East had only dared to whisper, the idea of Ukraine not just as a cultural region, but as a nation. The Galician revivalists looked eastward with a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing that their cultural kin were less fortunate. But through clandestine correspondence and shared literature, the Western and Eastern Ukrainian intelligentsia began to form bridges built on language, faith, memory, and hope. Religion, too, played a part. The Greek Catholic Church, particularly in Galicia, became a bastion of Ukrainian identity. Priests doubled as educators and activists, spreading nationalist sentiment from the pulpit as well as the classroom. In the Orthodox East, the church was more tightly controlled by the Russian state, but even here, local clergy found subtle ways to preserve tradition. By the dawn of the 20th century, the idea of Ukraine had returned to the people, not just as a land, but as a story they shared and a future they might yet shape. Nationalism, that powerful engine of the modern era, had entered the Ukrainian bloodstream. It would bring unity and pride, but also conflict and division. It was not a weapon Ukraine had sought, but it would soon become one they would be forced to wield. Part 8, Revolutions and Republics, the Turmoil of 1917 to 1921. The world shifted on its axis in 1917, and the tremors were felt from Petrograd to Kiev, from the palaces of tsars to the wheat fields of peasants. For Ukraine, the collapse of the Russian Empire opened a narrow and bloodied window, a chance, perhaps the first in centuries, to grasp the dream of self-rule. But this window did not swing open easily, nor did it remain so for long. What followed was not a single revolution, but a maelstrom of competing visions, ideologies, and armies. For 4 years, Ukraine became the contested ground for republics, empires, anarchists, and nationalists, each laying claim to a future none could fully control. It began in the aftermath of the February Revolution in Russia. With the Tsar overthrown, power in Petrograd teetered between the provisional government and the Soviets. In Kiev, too, the balance was unstable. A central Rada, or council, formed under the leadership of Mikhailo Hrushevsky, a respected historian and intellectual. What began as a body to represent Ukrainian interests quickly evolved into a national parliament, proclaiming the autonomy of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR, within a federated Russia. But history would allow no slow blossoming of this dream. The October Revolution in Russia, which brought the Bolsheviks to power, shattered even the illusion of cooperation. The Bolsheviks had little patience for nationalist experiments. They envisioned a world united by class, not ethnicity, and viewed Ukrainian independence as a bourgeois diversion at best, or counter-revolution at worst. When the Central Rada refused to recognize the authority of Lenin's government, the Red Army marched. Kiev fell. Then was retaken. Then fell again. The city changed hands more than a dozen times between 1917 and 1920. In the streets, posters for one army barely had time to fade before new ones were pasted over them. Each new regime brought its own currency, its own laws, and its own demands for loyalty. Red flags flew, then white, then black, then blue and yellow. Ukrainians fought in each of these armies, and against them too. The dream of independence flickered most brightly in 1918 when, following a treaty with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary helped install a short-lived Ukrainian state under the hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky. It was a conservative regime, one that rolled back many of the social reforms championed by the Central Rada, but it brought order for a time. Yet as the Central Powers collapsed at the end of World War I, so too did the hetmanate. Ukrainian nationalists, led by Simon Petlura, returned to power and redeclared the Ukrainian People's Republic. Meanwhile, in the West, another republic had formed, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, out of the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For the first time in centuries, East and West Ukraine had both declared sovereignty. On January 22, 1919, they celebrated the Act of Union in Kiev, symbolically uniting the two regions. But the moment was more romantic than real. The ZUNR was already at war with Poland, and the fledgling republics were besieged from every side, by Bolsheviks, Whites, Poles, and even roaming anarchist bands like that of Nestor Makhno, whose black flags and wild egalitarianism added yet another volatile force to an already shattered land. By 1920, the dream was dissolving. The Red Army gained the upper hand, and a brief alliance between Petlura and Poland only delayed the inevitable. In 1921, the last remnants of the UPR government went into exile. Ukraine, East and West, was swallowed again, partitioned between Soviet Russia and the newly reconstituted Poland. But something had changed. Though the republics had fallen, they had spoken aloud a word that could no longer be silenced: independence. The chaos had not forged a state, but it had awakened a people. Farmers who had never before voted now had debated constitutions. Soldiers who had served foreign crowns now wore Ukrainian insignias. The taste of self-rule, however bitter and brief, lingered. The battles of those years left Ukraine devastated in body and spirit. Entire towns were burned, populations decimated, hopes crushed beneath the boots of successive armies. But beneath the ashes lay a stubborn ember, an ember that even the might of the Soviet Union would not entirely extinguish. Part 9. The Soviet Yoke, Ukraine in the Shadow of Stalin. When the dust of revolution settled, the red banners did not merely flutter over Ukraine, they were nailed down. What emerged was not the independent republic dreamt of by nationalists and revolutionaries, but the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a member in name of a larger Soviet federation, yet tethered tightly to Moscow's will. The decade that followed the consolidation of Soviet power in Ukraine would etch deep wounds into the national psyche, wounds carved by famine, fear, and forced silence. At first, the Bolsheviks offered illusions of compromise. The 1920s saw the policy of korenizatsiya, or indigenization, meant to cultivate loyalty among non-Russian nationalities. Ukrainian language and culture received nominal support, schools opened in Ukrainian, and writers were encouraged, at least superficially, to develop a socialist Ukrainian identity. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, that the revolution might allow Ukraine to speak in its own voice. But behind the cultural window dressing, central power was consolidating. With Joseph Stalin's rise to unchallenged authority by the late 1920s, the thin veil of tolerance was torn away. The Soviet experiment moved into a brutal new phase: forced collectivization. The peasantry, still the majority in Ukraine, were deemed backward and suspect. Their independence from state control, especially in the fertile black soil regions, posed a threat to Stalin's vision of industrialized socialism. The response was swift and merciless. Grain quotas were raised to impossible levels. Villages that resisted collectivization were blacklisted, deprived of food and goods. Armed brigades swept through the countryside, confiscating not only grain but livestock, seeds, and even household goods. As the state extracted everything it could to fund industrial expansion and feed urban centers, the granaries of Europe became graveyards. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians starved to death in what would come to be known as the Holodomor, death by hunger. Whether engineered with genocidal intent or allowed to happen through callous indifference remains a matter of fierce historical debate. But to those who lived, or rather, those who died, in it, the distinction offered no comfort. Eyewitnesses spoke of children with bloated bellies begging in the streets, of mothers burying their sons before collapsing themselves, of silence so total in some villages that birds no longer landed in the trees. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, appeared in official NKVD reports. Yet publicly, the famine did not exist. The Soviet press remained mute, foreign journalists were silenced or misled, and those who dared speak were branded enemies of the people. Even as bodies were being buried in mass graves, Stalin struck again, not with famine, but with fear. The Great Terror of the late 1930s extended its claws deep into Ukraine. Intellectuals, teachers, military officers, and former revolutionaries were arrested, tortured, and executed. The very architects of the earlier Korenizatsiya policies were purged. The renaissance of Ukrainian culture that had flourished in the 1920s now ended in a massacre of minds. A generation of poets, playwrights, and professors vanished into gulags or execution basements. The message was clear: there would be no Ukrainian independence of thought, let alone of governance. Stalin's regime sought not just submission, but erasure. A singular Soviet identity was being forged in blood, one in which Moscow dictated the boundaries of memory and the limits of speech. Nationalism was a crime. Faith, too, was suspect. Churches were shuttered, clergy persecuted, and sacred traditions forced underground. Orthodoxy, which had once united Rus, was now under the thumb of a state that declared itself godless. Yet despite the cruelty, the culture could not be wholly smothered. Families whispered stories across kitchen tables. Songs banned in public were hummed in private. And though the famine decimated villages, it also planted seeds of defiance. Quietly, painfully, a Ukrainian identity endured, not the one officially permitted in Soviet textbooks, but one born of suffering, memory, and unyielding will. As the 1930s waned and Europe edged toward war, Ukraine remained trapped in the iron embrace of Stalin's vision. It was no longer the frontier battleground of revolutions, but a crucified land within an empire that ruled with steel and silence. Part 10, Bloodlands, Ukraine between Hitler and Stalin. To walk through Ukraine in the 1940s was to wander across a graveyard with invisible headstones. The land, already cracked by famine and terror, would now be drenched in a different kind of blood, spilled not by drought or decree, but by tanks, bombs, and bullets. Between two ruthless tyrants, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, Ukraine found itself caught in a vice, pressed on all sides by ideologies that saw it not as a nation, but as a prize. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, that chilling marriage of convenience between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, cast its long shadow over Eastern Europe. Within its secret clauses lay the fate of Poland, and of Western Ukraine. When Hitler invaded Poland from the west and Stalin marched in from the east, the Ukrainian people once again found their borders redrawn without their consent. Cities like Lviv and Chernobyl, once under Polish rule, were absorbed into the Soviet sphere. The Red Army arrived not as liberators, but as occupiers. Deportations began immediately. Landowners, priests, teachers, and anyone with a past deemed suspect were loaded into cattle cars bound for Siberia. Families vanished overnight. In place of Polish control came Soviet commissars, and the iron net of Stalin's rule was cast wider still. Then, in June 1941, the pact shattered like brittle glass. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, unleashed the fury of Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. Ukraine became the central battleground. Hitler's war machine surged across the steppes with terrifying speed. Cities fell in weeks. Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa became occupied zones. the Soviet retreat was chaotic and brutal. Bridges were blown, harvests scorched, and entire villages evacuated or abandoned. The Red Army's orders left nothing to the enemy, even if it meant starving their own. At first, some Ukrainians welcomed the German advance, not out of allegiance, but out of desperation. After years of famine, purges, and silence, any change seemed preferable. Some hoped for independence, for freedom from Moscow's grip. But hope was a currency quickly devalued. The Nazi vision for Ukraine was not one of liberation but of annihilation and exploitation. Hitler saw Ukraine as Lebensraum, living space for Germans, to be cleared of Slavs and Jews. Its fertile fields were to feed the Reich, its people reduced to laborers or worse. The Holocaust in Ukraine was swift and merciless. More than 1 million Jews were murdered on Ukrainian soil, not in gas chambers, but in forests, ravines, and fields. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were shot over 2 days in 1941, their bodies piled in layers beneath the earth. Across the country, Einsatzgruppen death squads, aided at times by local collaborators, carried out mass executions. Synagogues were burned, ghettos walled, and entire towns erased from the map of the living. But Nazi brutality did not end with the Jews. Slavic civilians were rounded up for forced labor, villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and resistance was met with slaughter. The countryside echoed with the sounds of boots, gunfire, and weeping. Ukrainian nationalists, divided between those hoping to fight both Soviets and Nazis and those seeking autonomy under German rule, found themselves betrayed, imprisoned, or executed. No side offered sanctuary. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, emerged, fighting a three-front war against the Germans, the Soviets, and sometimes even their fellow Ukrainians. It was a time of shifting allegiances, of desperate survival, and of choices made under impossible circumstances. As the tide of war turned, the Red Army returned, no longer retreating, but advancing. From Stalingrad to Kursk, the Soviets pushed westward with brutal momentum. By 1944, Ukraine was once again under Soviet control, but liberation came dressed in the same grim uniform that had starved and silenced the nation a decade earlier. Collaborators were executed or deported. Villages suspected of aiding the Nazis faced collective punishment. The western regions, with their history of resistance, became the focus of relentless suppression. The forests of Galicia and Volhynia whispered with guerrilla warfare, even as the rest of Europe celebrated peace. By war's end, Ukraine had lost nearly 8 million people, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities were reduced to rubble. The population was scarred by trauma, mistrust, and the impossible moral burdens of survival under dual occupation. And yet, even in the ashes, the identity endured. Ukraine had once again survived the designs of men who saw it only as a resource or a battlefield. But the cost would reverberate for generations. Part 11, Cold War Chains, Ukraine Behind the Iron Curtain. As the guns fell silent across Europe in 1945, Ukraine found itself once again yoked to the Soviet Union, its fields scorched, its cities broken, its people mourning the immeasurable toll of the Second World War. But peace, if it could be called that, came not as freedom but as a new kind of imprisonment, less visible than the occupation by Hitler's troops, but no less profound in its grip. Ukraine was now a republic within the USSR, stitched tightly into a vast authoritarian machine where ideology, loyalty, and silence were demanded in equal measure. The Iron Curtain descended over Eastern Europe, and Ukraine was trapped firmly behind it. The post-war years brought reconstruction, but also repression. Stalin's regime, paranoid and unyielding, returned to Ukraine with a vengeance. The western regions, particularly Galicia and Volhynia, had been hotbeds of resistance during the war, harboring nationalist fighters and guerrilla movements like the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, who had opposed both Nazis and Soviets. These regions were now subjected to sweeping purges, with thousands deported to Siberia or executed as enemies of the state. The forests that had once sheltered partisans now became silent witnesses to the collapse of hope. Soviet security forces hunted the last insurgents into the 1950s, their resistance gradually extinguished under the weight of mass arrests, informant networks, and fear. For the rest of Ukraine, Stalin's post-war policies echoed the terrors of the 1930s. Collectivization resumed in full force. Those who had fled the kolkhoz system during the war were compelled to return. Farms were forcibly consolidated, and private land ownership remained a crime. The memory of famine lingered in the bones of the elderly, unspoken but ever-present. The cities, meanwhile, were rebuilt in the image of Soviet modernity, grand, symmetrical, and austere. Apartment blocks rose where neighborhoods had once stood, and factories churned day and night, fueling the ambitions of a planned economy. Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Donetsk became industrial hubs, tied to Moscow's vision of Soviet power. But behind the gray walls and smokestacks lay a quieter story, of language erased, of faith repressed, and of identity diluted. Religion, particularly Ukrainian Orthodoxy and the Greek Catholic Church, faced relentless persecution. The Greek Catholic Church, with its ties to the Vatican and deep roots in western Ukraine, was outlawed in 1946. Priests were arrested, churches shuttered or handed over to the Orthodox Church under state control. Believers were driven underground, gathering in secret for worship, clinging to their traditions with quiet defiance. Orthodox institutions, though allowed to exist, were tightly monitored, and sermons were censored to ensure ideological compliance. The state promoted atheism as a pillar of progress, replacing icons with portraits of Lenin and replacing holy days with parades of tractors and banners. The Ukrainian language, too, was subtly but systematically sidelined. Russian became the lingua franca of power, of education, of aspiration. Schools taught in Russian, universities demanded Russian fluency, and to rise in the party or in industry was to adopt the language and the mindset of Moscow. Ukrainian persisted in rural areas, in the homes of babushkas and in whispered poetry, but it was treated as provincial, useful for folklore, perhaps, but not for the future. Writers who dared to assert a distinct Ukrainian voice were surveilled or silenced. The cultural thaw of the Khrushchev era brought a brief blossoming of national expression, but it was quickly reined in as the pendulum swung back toward repression under Brezhnev. And yet, beneath the iron layers of control, something quietly stirred. The memory of independence, though faint, never fully died. In the western hills and the eastern mines, in the libraries of Kiev and the folk songs of Poltava, a quiet sense of distinctiveness endured. Ukraine was not Russia, it had its own past, its own martyrs, its own vision of what it might be. That idea could not be bombed or buried or rewritten entirely, no matter how many textbooks were changed or how many statues of Lenin rose in the public squares. As the Cold War raged on, Ukraine remained a loyal Soviet republic on the surface, sending cosmonauts into space, soldiers into parades, and poets into exile. But the chains, though heavy, were not eternal. The cracks were beginning to form, hairline fractures in the monolith of Soviet control. And when the winds of change would finally blow in the late 1980s, it would be in Ukraine, as much as in Moscow or Berlin, where the tremors would be felt most deeply. Part 12, Chernobyl, Fire in the Land and the Failures of the System. It began with a low rumble before dawn, a mechanical roar in the belly of a power station nestled in the northern woodlands of Soviet Ukraine. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, ripping the lid from its core and belching a deadly plume of radioactive ash into the night sky. The wind carried it silently over forests, rivers, and towns. It crossed borders, oceans, decades. It would become not only the worst nuclear disaster in human history, but a symbol of secrecy, of state failure, and of a regime nearing its own slow implosion. Pripyat, the city closest to the plant, slept on in those early hours. Its streets, built to house the workers of the atomic age, were still humming with the naive promise of Soviet engineering. Concrete high-rises, wide boulevards, schools, amusement parks, all designed to embody modernity and scientific progress. And yet, as radiation levels surged to unimaginable heights, the citizens were told nothing. Children went to school. Couples strolled under blooming chestnut trees. Life continued in deadly ignorance, because in the USSR, truth was not a right, it was a calculated instrument of power. The Soviet system, vast and rigid, had been built on the illusion of control. But Chernobyl revealed its inner rot. The disaster was the result of a safety test gone catastrophically wrong, flawed design, inadequate training, a culture that punished whistleblowers and rewarded blind compliance. When the explosion happened, plant operators were left without protocols, guidance, or honesty. It took nearly 2 full days before the evacuation of Pripyat began, and even then, it was presented as temporary. People were told to pack only a few belongings. Most would never return. For Ukraine, Chernobyl was more than a tragedy. It was a trauma etched into the soil, the forests, the DNA of its people. The zone of exclusion, a 30-kilometer radius, became a haunted scar on the map, home only to ghost towns, wild animals, and those too old or too stubborn to leave. Over 350,000 people were ultimately displaced. Countless thousands of liquidators, soldiers, firemen, workers, were sent to clean up the disaster, many without proper protection, their sacrifices hidden behind medals and silences. The radioactive cloud swept far beyond Ukraine, across Belarus, into Scandinavia, and over Europe. The world learned of the explosion not from Moscow, but from alarms in a Swedish nuclear plant detecting anomalous radiation levels. This silence was not an oversight, it was policy. The Soviet leadership feared admitting failure more than facing fallout. When Mikhail Gorbachev finally addressed the nation about Chernobyl weeks later, the damage, to bodies, trust, and legitimacy, was already done. In Ukraine, the disaster struck at something deeper than infrastructure. It fractured the faith of a generation raised on Soviet promises. It laid bare the price of obedience and the cost of silence. For many Ukrainians, it marked the beginning of a psychological shift, from reluctant Soviet citizens to emerging national witnesses. Poets, scientists, mothers, and priests began to ask sharper questions, and some dared to answer them aloud. Why had they not been told? Why had they been left to breathe poison, to watch children fall ill, to bury the truth along with the dead? Chernobyl became a metaphor, a radioactive symbol of what happens when a system values control over conscience, and image over life. It exposed how deeply Ukraine was entwined in a larger machinery that did not always regard its republics as people, but as statistics, numbers to be managed, costs to be calculated. In the years that followed, as glasnost and perestroika took hold under Gorbachev, the echoes of Chernobyl would only grow louder. Environmental activism took root. Ukrainian cultural and linguistic revival gained momentum. People began to see not only the physical damage but the moral consequences of being governed from afar. Chernobyl did not cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it revealed its fatal flaw, a system so obsessed with order that it could not adapt to chaos. In the reactor's molten heart, something else had begun to burn, not just uranium, but illusion. The fire that raged in the land was mirrored by a quiet blaze in the hearts of the people, and Ukraine, though still chained, had begun to awaken. Part 13, Winds of Change, Perestroika and the National Awakening. As the 1980s drew to a close, the foundations of the Soviet Union trembled, not from the thunder of armies or foreign conquest, but from within. The winds that stirred through Moscow's marble halls were not yet hurricanes, but their chill was unmistakable. Gorbachev's twin policies, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, were supposed to save the system. Instead, they cracked it open like ancient stone, revealing centuries of suppressed voices, forgotten histories, and dormant dreams. And in Ukraine, those voices began to rise like a tide. To the west, the Iron Curtain began to rust and crumble. But in Ukraine, the legacy of Chernobyl had already sown the seeds of dissent. People who had once obeyed in silence now whispered in kitchens, wrote cautious articles in reform newspapers, gathered in quiet circles of poetry, and sang old songs in their native tongue. What had once been an underground current of identity, hidden beneath decades of forced Russification and centralized control, now began to surface. National memory, like embers beneath ash, started to glow again. Throughout the late 1980s, small movements took root. They were cultural, environmental, linguistic, never openly political at first, for fear was still a habit not easily broken. Writers and intellectuals began to call for greater recognition of Ukrainian language and heritage. Students demanded access to texts long banned, histories long denied. And in the churches, still under pressure and restriction, quiet gatherings began to blossom into something more defiant. The once dormant Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, outlawed by Stalin, emerged from the catacombs, its faithful holding liturgies in the open air. The Communist Party, though still in control, found itself increasingly unable to silence dissent. The bureaucratic machinery that had once functioned with iron precision now sputtered, its gears rusted by contradiction. Glasnost had flung open the archives. Suddenly, Ukrainians could read about the Holodomor, the man-made famine of the 1930s that had starved millions. The truth, buried for so long, ignited grief, rage, and a demand for recognition. For many, this was a revelation not just of the past, but of who they were. In Lviv, Kiev, and Kharkiv, public demonstrations began to draw crowds, first in the hundreds, then thousands. What began as ecological protests or calls for greater autonomy soon evolved into open calls for independence. In 1989, the People's Movement of Ukraine, known as Ruk, was founded, a coalition of writers, teachers, scientists, and citizens who dared to imagine a future beyond Soviet rule. They did not carry weapons, but books, flags, and songs. Their protests were peaceful, but powerful, drawing on the deep well of Ukraine's cultural memory. Language became a battleground, a symbol of selfhood. Ukrainian, long relegated to the countryside or private life, began to be spoken proudly in public, taught in schools, and printed in books. Statues of Lenin that had once towered silently over every city square now faced graffiti, protest, and in some cases, removal. What had once seemed immutable now cracked beneath the weight of popular will. In the Carpathians, Hutzel shepherds passed down folk songs no longer outlawed. In the Donbas, miners began to speak of labor rights and representation. In Kiev, a human chain of over 1 million Ukrainians stretched hundreds of kilometers on the anniversary of the 1919 Act of Unity, a silent, living testament to the yearning for national rebirth. But the awakening was not only cultural or symbolic. It was also practical, driven by a generation that had come of age amidst stagnation, shortages, and lies. They wanted clean air, honest history, freedom of expression, and the right to choose their own future. They were not anti-Russian, they were anti-imperial. And their vision was not of isolation, but of dignity. Gorbachev, for all his reforms, had unleashed forces he could not control. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Soviet Union stood like an aging leviathan, groaning under its contradictions. In Ukraine, the dream of independence, once relegated to exile poets and forbidden songs, now stepped into the daylight. The stage was set. The people were ready. And soon, history would turn. Part 14, The Long Goodbye, Decline and Collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not fall with a single gunshot or an earthquake that shook its mighty foundations. It unraveled in silence, with the steady rustling of papers, the quiet murmur of dissent, the slow erosion of fear. By the early 1990s, the empire that had once marched through Berlin, launched rockets to the moon, and ruled a sixth of the earth was hollowed out by contradictions it could no longer ignore. And in Ukraine, the unraveling felt both liberating and uncertain, like watching the bars of a cage fall away, only to glimpse a storm on the horizon. Economic paralysis gripped the Union like frost. Grocery store shelves, once meager, turned barren. Inflation turned salaries into paper dreams. Entire industries, once shielded by central planning, collapsed under their own inefficiency. The promises of socialism had long faded into slogans, and people stopped listening. In Ukraine, the coal mines of Donetsk and the factories of Dnipro slowed to a crawl. Pensioners waited in line for bread, not victory. Students marched not in celebration, but protest. In the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev tried to hold the crumbling structure together with vision and compromise, but the very freedoms he had allowed began to undo the unity he hoped to preserve. Across the republics, voices long suppressed now demanded autonomy, recognition, and, most dangerously, independence. The Union was no longer a union in spirit, only in name. In August 1991, the final blow came not from outside, but from within. A group of hardline communists, horrified by Gorbachev's reforms, launched a coup in Moscow. Tanks rolled into the streets. Television broadcasts were interrupted. It looked, for a moment, like the old guard might return. But in Kiev, in Lviv, in Odessa, people did not cower. They remembered the human chains, the rallies, the unmarked graves. They had tasted the air of dissent and would not go back. The coup collapsed within days, but its failure marked the death knell of Soviet legitimacy. In Ukraine, the parliament seized the moment. On August 24, 1991, just days after the failed putsch, Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada declared independence. The announcement was greeted not with civil war or repression, but with celebration. Ukrainian flags, blue and yellow like wheat under sky, waved in the streets. People wept. They sang. They dared to believe. But independence on paper required validation from the people. On December 1, 1991, Ukraine held a referendum. Over 90% of voters across all regions, including Russian-speaking areas like Crimea and Donetsk, voted in favor. It was a landslide not just in numbers, but in spirit. Ukraine had spoken. Not in anger, but with clarity. They would no longer be a province. They would be a nation. The reverberations were immediate. Gorbachev, having lost not just a republic but the keystone of the Slavic triad, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, found his position untenable. By the end of December, he resigned. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The Soviet Union, born in fire and ideology, faded into history with the quiet click of a pen. For Ukraine, the moment was both triumphant and terrifying. The old order had vanished, but a new one had yet to be built. The country inherited a Soviet legacy of pollution, corruption, economic dependence, and nuclear weapons. Its borders were fixed, but its identity still forming. For centuries, Ukraine had been the frontier, between empires, between faiths, between East and West. Now, it was its own. In the years to come, Ukraine would wrestle with that independence, with defining it, defending it, and making it real. The ghosts of the past were not easily exorcised. But for the first time in generations, the future belonged to Ukrainians themselves. As the curtain fell on the Soviet era, the story of Ukraine was just beginning to unfold on the world stage. Part 15, Nation in Transition, The Struggles of a New Independence. Independence arrived not like a sunrise but like an earthquake, shaking loose old certainties, dislodging long-standing structures, and leaving behind a fractured terrain where possibility and peril coexisted. For Ukraine, the 1990s were not a triumphant parade into nationhood but a stumbling journey through uncertainty, economic ruin, and political improvisation. The red banners had fallen, but in their place rose a flag not yet weathered by governance or unity. A state had been born, but a nation, cohesive, confident, and stable, was still a dream. In the earliest days, the government in Kiev faced Herculean tasks with little more than inherited Soviet bureaucracy and a hope that history was finally on their side. The economy, once a cog in the vast machinery of central planning, collapsed in the absence of both direction and demand. Hyperinflation devoured savings. The currency, the karbovanets, became so unstable that it was often cheaper to burn bills than to buy firewood. Industries stood still. Workers went unpaid. The social contract had disintegrated overnight, and no one was sure what would replace it. Amid this chaos, Ukraine had to define itself. What did it mean to be Ukrainian in a land where many still thought in Russian, where generations had been raised on Soviet myths, where regional differences ran deep? In the West, in cities like Lviv, national identity bloomed with passion and purpose. Streets were renamed, statues toppled, language revived. But in the East and South, in Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, Soviet nostalgia lingered, and the bonds to Moscow felt harder to sever. The question of identity was not academic, it was existential. Political life in the new Ukraine was both vibrant and volatile. Former communists rebranded as reformers. Oligarchs rose from the ashes of privatization, seizing state industries at bargain prices and becoming kingmakers overnight. Corruption, once a whispered norm, became a visible pillar of the system. Parliament was a theater of shifting allegiances, where laws were drafted with an eye not toward public welfare, but private gain. Yet amid this dysfunction, civil society took root, small, often ignored, but quietly growing in strength. Foreign policy, too, became a balancing act on a geopolitical tightrope. Ukraine had given up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances, an act of global goodwill that seemed wise at the time. It sought friendship with the West while trying not to alienate Russia, its largest trading partner and former ruler. This ambiguous position, neither fully East nor fully West, defined much of Ukraine's early diplomacy and set the stage for future tension. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in return for denuclearization, was signed with the assumption that international law would be honored. But law, as Ukraine would later discover, is only as strong as those who choose to uphold it. In the cultural sphere, Ukrainian artists, writers, and musicians began to explore their heritage anew. Folk traditions mixed with postmodern experimentation. Ukrainian language education expanded, though slowly and unevenly. For many, it was the first time their identity was not something to conceal or apologize for, but something to celebrate, even if it still felt fragile. Through the long, lean years of the 1990s, Ukraine survived, but barely. Millions emigrated, searching for work in Poland, Russia, Italy, or Canada. Entire towns were hollowed out by joblessness. Crime surged. Faith in democracy waned. Yet the state did not collapse. It held, loosely and imperfectly, through elections and protests, scandals and crises. A new generation was coming of age, one not raised in the shadow of Stalin, but in the flickering light of independence. By the dawn of the 21st century, Ukraine was still searching for its soul. The wounds of empire had not fully healed. The promises of freedom had not yet been kept. But the people, resilient and restless, had not given up. They were waiting, not for a savior, but for a spark. And that spark, as history would soon reveal, was coming. Part 16, The Orange Revolution, A Nation Refuses to be Silenced. Winter came early to Kyiv in 2004, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the storm gathering in the hearts of Ukrainians. This was no ordinary season, it was a reckoning. The kindling had been laid for years, simmering anger at corruption, broken promises, and an ever-widening chasm between the people and those who ruled them. And when the presidential election was marred by fraud too blatant to ignore, the spark ignited. What followed was not just a protest, it was a national awakening. The seeds of the Orange Revolution were sown in the struggle between two men, Viktor Yushchenko, the reform-minded opposition candidate promising a pro-European path and democratic renewal, and Viktor Yanukovych, the Kremlin-backed incumbent representing continuity with a corrupt and oligarchic past. But behind those names stood much more. This was a contest between visions of Ukraine itself, one leaning toward Western ideals and civic freedom, the other toward authoritarianism and shadowy power plays rooted in the old Soviet logic. When the initial results were announced, claiming Yanukovych as victor, the reaction was swift and visceral. Exit polls had told a different story, one in which Yushchenko had won decisively. Evidence of vote tampering poured in, ballot box stuffing, voter intimidation, even invisible ink used to alter ballots. And so, the people took to the streets, not in scattered dissent but in a tidal wave of orange flags, scarves, and solidarity. Kyiv's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, became the revolution's beating heart. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, gathered in defiant hope. Students, pensioners, clergy, civil servants, bundled in layers against the snow, sleeping in tents, chanting under a canopy of protest banners, held their ground day after day, night after night. The mood was tense but jubilant, fearful yet unyielding. There were no weapons, only resolve. The revolution, for all its size and fury, remained largely peaceful, a testament to the discipline of a people determined not to mirror the violence they opposed. Orange was the color of their cause, but it came to mean more than just a campaign choice. It became the hue of awakening, of unity, of righteous resistance. Musicians played, poets read, priests prayed. People brought soup and blankets to strangers. A sense of civic identity, once fractured and elusive, crystallized in the cold air. For the first time in a generation, Ukrainians weren't just reacting to history, they were writing it. International observers took note. The world watched, some with admiration, others with unease. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, saw in this uprising a dangerous precedent, a neighboring people demanding a voice, defying authoritarian control. The West, cautiously optimistic, supported the democratic spirit but tread carefully, wary of provoking the Kremlin. Ukraine, caught once again between titanic geopolitical forces, stood its ground. After weeks of protest and mounting pressure, the Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled the fraudulent runoff vote. A new election was held, and this time the will of the people prevailed. Yushchenko was declared the rightful president. There was celebration, yes, but not naivety. The revolution had won a battle, but not yet the war for Ukraine's future. Still, the Orange Revolution left an indelible mark. It proved that the people could not be silenced. That civil resistance, even in the face of entrenched power, could prevail. It stirred something deep and enduring in the Ukrainian consciousness, a sense of agency, of ownership over their country's destiny. But revolutions are rarely the end of the story. They are, more often, the beginning of a long, hard road. And in the years that followed, disillusionment crept in. The promises of reform stalled. The political class fractured. Old habits returned in new clothes. And yet, something fundamental had changed. A line had been crossed. Ukrainians had tasted the power of collective voice, and they would not forget it. The revolution was not perfect. Its aftermath was messy and incomplete. But it mattered. It mattered because, for once, Ukraine had not waited for permission to rise. It had simply done so. Part 17, Between Dreams and Disappointment, the struggle to deliver on the promise. The crowds had dispersed. The orange banners, once fluttering defiantly above Independence Square, were folded and stored away, relics of a moment that had shimmered with possibility. Viktor Yushchenko, scarred both physically and politically from his near-fatal poisoning, stood at the helm of a nation that had dared to hope. The Orange Revolution had lifted Ukraine into the global spotlight as a beacon of democratic awakening. But as the euphoria faded and the real work of governance began, the dream met the grinding gears of reality. Ukraine, in the years following the revolution, found itself caught between the aspiration of its people and the inertia of its institutions. Reform proved elusive. The system, corroded by years of Soviet legacy and post-independence opportunism, resisted change. Corruption, though publicly condemned, remained deeply entrenched in the judiciary, in the civil service, even in the halls of parliament. The promise of transformation was clear, but the pathway was fogged with self-interest and infighting. Yushchenko, once a symbol of hope, struggled to navigate the labyrinth of post-revolution politics. His alliance with Yulia Tymoshenko, his fiery orange comrade, quickly frayed. Personal ambition clashed with ideological commitment. Their once shared vision unraveled into public quarrels and policy gridlock. The unity that had electrified the Maidan splintered, and with it, the trust of a weary population. The economy, fragile to begin with, faltered further under the weight of global pressures and domestic mismanagement. Inflation soared, wages stagnated, and the gap between promise and performance widened. Ukrainians, who had braved the cold in 2004 believing they were building something better, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was the revolution betrayed? Or had it simply revealed how difficult genuine change could be? And yet, not all was lost. Though political leaders faltered, a new civic consciousness had taken root. Civil society grew more active and vigilant. Independent media, bolstered by the energy of the revolution, pushed boundaries and exposed wrongdoing. NGOs flourished, watchdog groups multiplied, and a new generation of young Ukrainians, raised in the shadow of Maidan, began to see themselves not as passive subjects of history, but as its authors. The geopolitical tug-of-war also intensified. Ukraine, ever the prize in the struggle between East and West, found itself pressed on all sides. Russia watched the disarray with both alarm and glee, seeking opportunities to reassert influence. Meanwhile, the West, while offering rhetorical support, was often slow and cautious in its material backing. Integration with the European Union remained more dream than reality, and NATO membership, though spoken of, remained a distant prospect, shadowed by Russian ire. In rural villages and industrial towns, skepticism returned. Many who had never marched on Maidan, who had watched the revolution unfold on television with cautious hope, now turned back to familiar patterns: cynicism, survivalism, distrust. The revolution, it seemed, had stirred a storm but left many questions unanswered. And yet, beneath the disappointment, something deeper stirred. The Orange Revolution had cracked open a window, and though the wind howled in, it also brought light. Ukrainians had seen what was possible, however briefly. They had seen themselves not just as citizens of a troubled state, but as participants in a shared, living democracy. It would take more than one revolution. More than one leader. More than one cold winter of courage. But something irreversible had begun. The people had risen once, and though they now stumbled through the fog of political betrayal and broken promises, they would rise again. The arc of Ukraine's transformation was long, winding, and often painful, but it was bending, inch by inch, toward a future not yet fully imagined. Part 18, Russia's Return, Soft Power, Hard Pressure, and the Road to Annexation. The years that followed the Orange Revolution saw Ukraine drifting in the murky shallows between West and East, with every effort at reform slowed by division and distrust. But while Ukraine wrestled with its own demons, another power stirred with calculated intention. Russia, long resentful of the Orange Tide and the pro-European tilt it represented, began a quiet but deliberate campaign to draw its former vassal back into its orbit, not with tanks or missiles, but with stories, contracts, networks, and gas pipelines. At first, it was subtle. Russian television channels, still widely viewed across much of eastern and southern Ukraine, spun narratives of nostalgia, shared history, and mutual destiny. In cities like Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Odessa, where Russian remained the dominant tongue, Moscow's media cultivated a vision of Ukraine not as a sovereign actor but as a sibling state momentarily led astray. This soft power proved potent. It whispered to old loyalties, soothed post-Soviet discontent, and wrapped imperial ambition in the gentle cloak of cultural fraternity. But cultural influence was only one strand of the rope. The energy lifeline gave Moscow leverage of a more tangible sort. Gazprom, the Russian state-controlled gas giant, raised and lowered prices at will, sometimes over unpaid debts, often as a signal of displeasure. Entire winters became hostage to these negotiations, with Ukraine's cities caught in the crossfire of geopolitical pricing. The Kremlin had found a lever, and it pressed hard. Meanwhile, oligarchs with dual business interests, operating in both Kiev and Moscow, became bridges and brokers in a transactional game that often left the national interest behind. Russia also fostered deeper ties with Ukraine's internal political actors. Viktor Yanukovych, a defeated figure after 2004, returned to the political scene with renewed vigor, rebranding himself as a stabilizer, a pragmatist. His party of regions drew support from Russian-speaking strongholds, and with backing both tacit and material from Moscow, he won the 2010 presidential election. It marked a reversal of the Orange Tide and the start of Ukraine's slow, uneasy pivot back toward the Kremlin's gravitational pull. Yet even then, Russia's pressure remained cloaked in diplomacy. Trade deals, offers of investment, cultural festivals, and lavish bilateral summits painted a picture of renewed partnership. Yanukovych walked a delicate tightrope, securing loans and deals from the EU while flirting with Russia's proposed Eurasian customs union. But by late 2013, the balancing act cracked. The long-awaited EU association agreement sat ready for signature. Brussels extended its hand. So did Moscow, but with a clenched fist beneath a velvet glove. What followed was unmistakable. Russia unleashed a barrage of economic threats, slapping bans on Ukrainian exports and signaling that a European path would come at great cost. Then came the carrot, a $15 billion aid package and discounted gas if Kyiv turned its back on the West. Yanukovych caved. He abandoned the EU deal just days before the signing. The decision detonated a firestorm. The Maidan would burn again. But long before the smoke rose in Kyiv, Russia had been laying other groundwork, especially in Crimea. Naval bases, local pro-Russian parties, intelligence operations, Moscow's hand had never truly let go. When revolution returned to Kyiv in early 2014, toppling Yanukovych and swinging Ukraine's trajectory once again westward, Russia acted. It cast off the cloak of soft power and unveiled the sharp edge of annexation. What began as pressure and persuasion had morphed into something far bolder. The road to Crimea's annexation was not an abrupt detour, it was a well-paved highway built over years, with layers of influence, propaganda, coercion, and opportunism. It was a reminder that in the post-Soviet space, the past is never dead, it is merely waiting for the right moment to reclaim its place. Part 19, Crimea, the peninsula that changed everything. The events that unfolded in Crimea in the early spring of 2014 did not so much surprise the world as stun it into a brief and breathless silence. One day, it was part of Ukraine, a sun-drenched peninsula jutting into the Black Sea, home to ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and a complex weave of history. The next, it was swallowed up by the Russian Federation, almost without a shot fired. But to understand how Crimea changed everything, one must look beneath the surface of that seemingly swift annexation and into the deeper currents of identity, memory, and imperial ambition that had long flowed beneath its shores. For Russia, Crimea was not merely a piece of land. It was mythic, sacred, a jewel in the crown of imperial memory. It held Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet's pride, and a city bound to Russian military lore since the Crimean War of the 1850s. Although Khrushchev had transferred Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1954, the population had remained overwhelmingly Russian-speaking, and in many quarters, loyal in spirit to Moscow. Decades later, Putin would exploit this sentiment with deadly precision. When Viktor Yanukovych fled Kyiv amidst the fiery uprisings of the Euromaidan, the Kremlin perceived not only a vacuum but an existential threat. In its eyes, Ukraine was slipping, again, into the Western orbit, with NATO expansion lurking behind the curtain. Crimea, with its military bases, its strategic position, and its Russian identity, could not be left in such uncertainty. What followed was swift and clinical. In late February 2014, unidentified troops, soon nicknamed Little Green Men, appeared across Crimea. They bore no insignia, but their discipline, weapons, and transport revealed everything. Russia denied involvement, even as it moved with surgical coordination to seize airports, government buildings, and media centers. The local parliament, under these conditions, held a referendum, called, conducted, and concluded in a matter of days. The result was overwhelming support for joining the Russian Federation, though the legitimacy of that vote remains deeply contested. Ethnic minorities, particularly the Crimean Tatars, boycotted the poll, fearing a return to the days of Soviet repression. International observers were barred. Western nations declared the referendum a sham, Russia declared it a triumph of self-determination. And then, just like that, Crimea was gone. Not lost in war or surrendered in diplomacy, but absorbed into Russia's embrace with a signature and a celebration in Moscow's Red Square. The global response was a cacophony of condemnation. Sanctions were imposed. Russia was ejected from the G8. The post-Cold War order, the fragile idea that borders in Europe were fixed and sacrosanct, had been shattered. Crimea became a watershed, not just for Ukraine, but for the world. It reintroduced the specter of land grabs in a supposedly stable continent. It reignited old anxieties across Eastern Europe, especially in the Baltics and Poland. And for Ukraine, it marked not just the loss of territory, but the opening act of a much larger, far bloodier conflict. In Crimea, a precedent had been set. A neighbor could be violated, sovereignty could be rewritten, and historical grievances could be weaponized in real time. The peninsula that once basked in its tourist-friendly image as the Soviet Riviera had become the flashpoint for a new geopolitical era. The war had not yet come to Donbas, but the winds had shifted. The world had changed, and the map had too. Crimea, once a quiet outpost of the post-Soviet compromise, had become the hinge on which modern Europe's uneasy peace would begin to creak. Part 20, Donbas, War Without End. When the world turned its shocked eyes toward Crimea in the spring of 2014, it did not yet grasp that the greater storm was still gathering to the east. While the annexation of Crimea was swift and almost bloodless, what erupted in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine was something far murkier, grimmer, and enduring. In the coal-streaked heartlands of Donetsk and Luhansk, where industrial smokestacks loom over crumbling Soviet-era cities and Russian language and identity run deep, a new chapter of the Ukraine-Russia saga ignited, not with parades or referenda, but with shadow warfare, trenches, and grinding death. It was a war that had no clear beginning, no obvious end, and no simple truths. It began with whispers, agitators appearing in cities, rallies calling for autonomy or secession, armed men with covered faces storming government buildings. What looked at first like local unrest quickly revealed the fingerprints of foreign interference. Russian intelligence operatives, veterans of Crimea's Green Men campaign, and mercenaries slipped across the porous border. Weapons caches appeared as if conjured from thin air. Soon, self-proclaimed People's Republics were declared in Donetsk and Luhansk, rejecting the authority of Kiev and swearing allegiance to a nebulous dream of Novorossiya, a historical term resurrected by the Kremlin to evoke imperial grandeur and justify partition. Ukraine, reeling from the loss of Crimea and political chaos in Kiev, was unprepared for full-scale conflict. Hastily assembled volunteer battalions joined ill-equipped regular forces in the east. The fighting that ensued was not the modern, mechanized warfare of nation-states but a grim slog of ambushes, artillery exchanges, and urban combat. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and towns like Sloviansk, Debaltseve, and Avdiivka became names synonymous with trauma and destruction. Russia's role remained officially denied, even as the evidence piled up: satellite imagery of convoys, the presence of advanced Russian weaponry, and the silent return of Russian soldiers in body bags labeled volunteers. The war morphed into a proxy conflict, with Russia pulling the strings while avoiding full-blown international confrontation. Western nations imposed sanctions, but diplomatic outrage did little to change the facts on the ground. The Minsk agreements, negotiated ceasefires in 2014 and 2015, were broken almost as soon as they were signed. Lines were drawn, but they shifted with every season. The front was a bleeding scar across Ukraine's eastern flank, where villages fell and rose again in the ash of artillery. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands were killed, many more wounded, and over 2 million people were displaced. A new generation of Ukrainians grew up with air raid sirens, cratered streets, and the dull, constant threat of death. For Russia, the Donbas became a pressure valve, a way to destabilize Ukraine, to prevent its drift westward, and to sow doubt about its territorial integrity. For Ukraine, it was a crucible of national identity. The war, for all its horror, began to forge something powerful, a sense of Ukrainian unity not based on language or ethnicity, but on survival, dignity, and resistance. Yet the war never truly ended. It became a frozen conflict in name only, because the shelling never really stopped. Peace was discussed in distant capitals while soldiers died in silent trenches. The world's attention wavered, especially as crises emerged elsewhere, but the Donbas festered. Propaganda, misinformation, and fatigue blurred the lines between truth and fiction. Was it civil war? Foreign invasion? Rebellion? The labels changed, but the suffering did not. By the time full-scale invasion loomed in 2022, the Donbas was already a graveyard of illusions. It had shown the world that war in Europe was no relic of the past. It had become a proving ground for hybrid warfare, where cyber attacks, media manipulation, and conventional arms blended into a new form of destabilization. Most of all, it stood as a warning, a bleeding wound from which no one, not even those far removed, could claim innocence or ignorance. The Donbas was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a land of miners, factory workers, and quiet lives lived in the shadows of industry. But in war, the ordinary is often the first to be destroyed. What remained was a shattered region, a frozen echo of a war that refused to die, and a symbol of how quickly the boundaries of peace can be erased when the ghosts of empire rise again. Part 21, The War of Narratives, Truth as the First Casualty. Long before the first tanks rolled across the border, before artillery thundered in the east and long after any ceasefire was signed, another war was already raging, quieter perhaps, but no less destructive. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with words, not with soldiers, but with storytellers, influencers, trolls, and state-run media. It unfolded across social media platforms, television screens, and state briefings. And in this conflict, the truth, slippery, inconvenient, and often fragile, became the first casualty. In the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the war of narratives proved to be as important as the war on the ground. For Russia, narrative control was a weapon of choice. Kremlin-aligned media outlets constructed an alternate reality in which Ukraine's revolution had been orchestrated by fascists, backed by shadowy Western puppeteers. In this version of events, Russia was not an aggressor but a protector of Russian-speaking people, of culture, of history. The annexation of Crimea was portrayed as a homecoming, a liberation. The war in Donbas? A grassroots rebellion. And Ukraine? A broken, illegitimate state under foreign occupation. Meanwhile, Ukraine fought to reclaim its own story. The Maidan protests were framed not as a coup but as a people's revolution for dignity and self-determination. Russian actions were exposed as naked aggression. The annexation of Crimea was not liberation, it was theft. The war in Donbas was not an internal conflict, it was an invasion in disguise. Ukrainian journalists, international observers, and an emerging digital army of amateur sleuths and open-source investigators pushed back, posting satellite images, videos, testimonies, and timelines. But facts alone were not enough. In the digital age, information no longer travels alone, it comes wrapped in emotion, soaked in bias, filtered through belief. The global information landscape was chaotic, and truth became something negotiated, not accepted. Social media giants struggled to keep up with waves of disinformation campaigns. Fake news articles, deepfakes, and bots flooded feeds in multiple languages. Conspiracy theories blossomed on every side. Narratives clashed with violent intensity in Facebook comments, Twitter threads, and YouTube rants. For those living in Ukraine, the war of narratives was deeply personal. Families were split, not just physically by war but mentally by belief. A grandmother in Crimea might watch Russian news and believe Kyiv was overrun by Nazis. Her grandson in Lviv might fight on the front lines believing he defends a free and sovereign nation. Between them stood not only geography, but a chasm of narrative realities. Outside Ukraine, the world struggled to make sense of the conflict. Newsrooms balanced stories of geopolitics with human suffering, but even they weren't immune to the pull of narrative frames. Was this Cold War 2.0? A civil war? A clash of civilizations? Each explanation contained partial truths and dangerous simplifications. And all the while, public opinion fluctuated, empathy rose and fell, often depending on the virality of a video, a photo, or a personal story. In this climate, journalism became frontline work. Reporters risked their lives to document truth on the ground, yet even their accounts were questioned. To be believed became a struggle of its own. Meanwhile, the Russian state tightened its grip on internal narratives. Independent journalists were silenced, foreign outlets expelled, and censorship laws passed with alarming speed. Alternative viewpoints became not just controversial, but criminal. The state narrative was not to be questioned, it was to be lived. But perhaps the most insidious effect of the war of narratives was not misinformation, it was fatigue. The sheer volume of content, the speed at which truth was contested, the complexity of events, all of it overwhelmed. Many around the world, uncertain of whom to believe, chose not to believe at all. Indifference set in. Apathy became a shield against the noise. Yet narratives matter. They shape perception, and perception shapes policy. In the end, the battle over what is true becomes the battle over what is justifiable. Wars can be started, and prolonged, not only by soldiers, but by stories. The war in Ukraine is many things: a territorial conflict, a geopolitical standoff, a humanitarian disaster. But it is also a battle for memory, for meaning, and for the soul of history itself. And so long as competing truths fight for supremacy, the war of narratives will remain one of the most treacherous fronts, where the victors may not be those who are right, but those who are loudest. Part 22, The Global Chessboard, NATO, the EU, and the East-West Divide. To understand the war in Ukraine as simply a bilateral dispute between Kiev and Moscow is to miss the deeper tectonic shifts beneath its surface. The battlefield is Ukrainian soil, but the players seated at the Grand Board of Strategy reach far beyond the Dnipro. This is a confrontation shaped by decades of ideological, military, and economic maneuvering between the Western liberal order and the lingering gravitational pull of Russian imperial identity. And the pieces on this global chessboard, NATO, the European Union, and the geopolitical ambitions they represent, move not in isolation, but in reaction to each other, each turn calculated, each advance watched with wary eyes. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has been both a source of stability and contention in Eastern Europe. For countries like Poland, the Baltics, and Romania, joining the alliance was not only a security guarantee, but a rebuke of the Soviet past, a declaration that their future lay with the West. For Russia, however, NATO's steady expansion eastward was a creeping shadow, each new member state a reminder of its receding influence, each military exercise along its borders a perceived provocation. The promises, real or implied, about NATO's limits were recalled bitterly in Moscow, fueling the narrative of encirclement and betrayal. Ukraine, poised at the intersection of these worlds, became the most dangerous flashpoint. Though never a full NATO member, Ukraine's increasing cooperation with the alliance, joint drills, strategic partnerships, and military modernization, was viewed by Russia not as a partnership, but as a prelude. The 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, which declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members one day, was a pivotal moment. Vague in timeline but clear in intent, it crystallized Russia's fears and set a trajectory of confrontation that would eventually ignite in Georgia in 2008, and later, in Ukraine in 2014. But NATO is not the only institution in play. The European Union, with its vast web of treaties, economic integration, and democratic norms, offers another form of allegiance, one that speaks not through tanks, but through trade agreements and visa liberalization. For many Ukrainians, the desire to join the EU symbolized a break from corruption and autocracy, a reaching out toward prosperity, transparency, and the rule of law. The Euromaidan movement, after all, was sparked not by a military incursion, but by a shelved trade deal. The geopolitical implications of Ukraine choosing Brussels over Moscow sent shockwaves through the Kremlin's corridors of power. It was not just about economics, it was about influence, identity, and the direction of a people. In the years since, the EU's role in Ukraine has grown. Financial aid, humanitarian support, and sanctions against Russia have all woven the two more tightly together. Yet Europe itself remains divided, between old alliances and new fears, between economic interests in Russian energy and moral outrage over aggression. The war tested not just Ukraine's resilience, but the coherence of Europe's response. While the EU and NATO found unprecedented unity in some moments, in others they were fragmented by national politics, historical anxieties, and the specter of escalation. And then there is the broader East-West divide, a legacy of the Cold War that never fully healed. In Moscow's eyes, the post-Soviet world was never settled fairly. The collapse of the USSR was not liberation, but humiliation. NATO and EU expansion were not the spread of democracy, but encroachment. In this worldview, Russia was not a rogue actor, it was a cornered power defending its sphere of influence. In contrast, the West viewed Russia not as a misunderstood giant, but as a revisionist state determined to upend the rules-based order. Caught in this vortex of competing visions, Ukraine became both symbol and pawn. To the West, it was a front line of democracy, to Russia, a buffer state slipping away. And as the conflict dragged on, the stakes rose ever higher, not just for territory, but for the soul of the post-Cold War world. What does sovereignty mean in an interconnected world? Can borders still be sacred when influence bleeds across them? Is neutrality even possible in an age of alliances? These are the questions that play out on this global chessboard, where each move carries consequences, and each silence speaks volumes. The war in Ukraine is not the beginning of a new Cold War, it is a continuation of an old one, reshaped for the 21st century, still rooted in mistrust, power, and the search for dominance. And as long as the board remains set, the players, whether they wish to or not, will continue to play. Part 23, Sanctions, Supply Chains, and the Global Economic Fallout. When the first sanctions were levied against Russia in response to its 2014 annexation of Crimea, they were measured, cautious, almost surgical. A few banks here, a handful of individuals there, with the unspoken hope that pressure could deter aggression without rattling the global economic order. But by 2022, that calculus had changed. In the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world's economic arsenal was unleashed in unprecedented fashion, targeting oligarchs, cutting off banks from SWIFT, freezing central bank reserves, banning energy imports, and curtailing exports of critical technologies. It was a new kind of war, one not fought with tanks and drones, but with digits and dollars. The intention was to strangle the Russian war machine and send a clear message: in a globalized world, isolation is more than a threat, it is a sentence. Yet the results were not as straightforward as policymakers hoped. Russia, having weathered sanctions since 2014, had begun insulating its economy. Foreign reserves were shifted, supply chains reoriented toward Asia, and domestic production bolstered where possible. When the full brunt of sanctions hit in 2022, Russia stumbled, but did not fall. The ruble initially collapsed, only to rebound as energy exports, particularly to China and India, filled Moscow's coffers. The West discovered that the global economy is not a cleanly divided world of allies and enemies, it is a tangled web, and every tug on one strand pulls a dozen more. Nowhere was this more evident than in energy. Europe, long reliant on Russian natural gas, faced a crisis. Prices soared, factories shuttered, and governments scrambled to secure alternatives, from liquefied natural gas shipments across the Atlantic to accelerated investments in renewables. The pain was not theoretical, it hit citizens in their utility bills, businesses in their margins, and governments in their budgets. What had once been economic interdependence was now revealed as vulnerability. And in that revelation came a broader reassessment of globalization itself. The sanctions didn't just target Russia, they sent ripples through the arteries of global trade. Wheat shipments from Ukraine, once a lifeline for parts of Africa and the Middle East, were disrupted by blockades and bombings. Fertilizer supplies, key to agricultural output worldwide, became harder to procure as exports from both Russia and Belarus were curtailed. The world discovered, with uncomfortable clarity, just how much it depended on the very regions now engulfed in conflict. Supply chains, already frayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, were now reeling. Critical raw materials, nickel, palladium, titanium, became scarce, affecting industries from aerospace to semiconductors. Inflation surged not only in war-adjacent countries but across continents. In some places, breadlines returned. In others, protests flared as fuel costs and food shortages stirred public discontent. The economic front of the war proved to be truly global. At the same time, the sanctions regime revealed the limits of Western unity. While the US, the EU, the UK, and several allies moved in concert, large swathes of the world remained unmoved. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, many nations saw the war not as a moral crisis but as a distant conflict between great powers. Some abstained from UN votes, others continued trading with Russia, often at discounted rates. The emerging multipolar world became clearer in these choices, not merely a rejection of the West, but a recalibration of interests. And then came the corporate exodus. Hundreds of global companies pulled out of Russia, some under pressure, others by choice. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, tech firms, banks, they left behind not only revenue but decades of investment and cultural influence. It was a seismic shift, signaling that even private enterprise, long considered apolitical, could become a frontline actor in modern conflict. This new era of economic warfare blurred lines between state and corporate interests, between market forces and moral imperatives. But the longer the war dragged on, the more complex the picture became. Sanctions bred workarounds, black markets, and alliances of convenience. Nations built parallel payment systems. New trade corridors emerged. Russia, while bruised, adapted in ways that alarmed its adversaries. And as winter returned to Europe, the question loomed, how long could solidarity last when the costs became more deeply felt at home than on distant battlefields? In this theater of economic warfare, victory is elusive and suffering diffuse. The tools of finance are powerful, but they are blunt and often unpredictable. And as the world discovered, interdependence, once a source of peace, can be twisted into a weapon, or worse, a weakness. Part 24, Information Wars, Propaganda, Censorship, and the Struggle for Reality. In any war, the first casualty is truth. But in the digital age, the battlefield for truth itself has expanded beyond the borders of any one country or ideology. The war in Ukraine was not merely fought on the scorched fields of Donbas or in the streets of Mariupol, it was waged in timelines, news feeds, comment threads, and encrypted channels. Here, soldiers didn't wear uniforms. They carried smartphones. Their weapons weren't rifles, but carefully curated narratives, doctored videos, viral memes, and algorithmic firestorms. This was the information war, and in many ways, it proved just as consequential as any missile strike. From the very first day of the full-scale invasion, Russia and Ukraine both understood that perception would shape reality. Russia's state-controlled media unleashed a torrent of justifications. The invasion was a special military operation, intended to denazify Ukraine, to protect ethnic Russians, to resist NATO encroachment. Within Russia's closed media ecosystem, dissenting voices were silenced, independent outlets shuttered, foreign journalists expelled, and social media platforms banned or throttled. What remained was a curated version of events, echoing through television screens and telegram channels, designed not merely to convince, but to insulate, a narrative cocoon shielding the Russian public from uncomfortable truths. Ukraine, for its part, mounted a masterclass in asymmetric information warfare. President Zelensky, once a comedian, now became the wartime communicator-in-chief, addressing the world with clarity, defiance, and emotional resonance. Through slickly produced videos, raw battlefield footage, and daily addresses posted on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram, Ukraine rallied global support. Civilian testimonies, drone footage, images of bombed maternity wards and destroyed neighborhoods, these formed the heartbeat of Ukraine's counter-narrative, not a war of equals, but a story of David resisting Goliath. But the global information environment was far from binary. As misinformation flooded the internet, sorting fact from fiction became a daily struggle. Deepfakes, once futuristic novelties, began to appear, videos of supposed surrenders, fake Zelensky announcements, distorted timelines. Pro-Russian troll farms reactivated their networks, seeding confusion, amplifying conspiracies, and targeting both pro-Ukraine and anti-war sentiments in the West. The line between state actors and freelance propagandists blurred, with disinformation campaigns often cloaked in the language of skepticism or humanitarian concern. Meanwhile, Western governments began taking an uncharacteristically active role in the information battle. Intelligence agencies preemptively declassified reports to expose Russian intentions before they were acted upon. Social media companies, under pressure, took unprecedented steps, labeling state media, limiting reach, suspending accounts. The information space narrowed, not only in Russia, but globally. Questions emerged: in fighting propaganda, how much censorship was acceptable? Who decides what's true? Could the tools of moderation become tools of suppression? These questions struck at the heart of democratic societies, where free speech and open debate are bedrock principles. The war tested these principles to their limits. Some voices accused the West of hypocrisy, pointing to censorship, cancel culture, or bias in coverage. Others warned that failing to counter disinformation risked surrendering the battlefield entirely. The struggle wasn't just against Russian propaganda, it was against the fracturing of consensus, the erosion of shared truth, the very concept of objective reality. In Ukraine, journalists risked their lives to document atrocities. In Russia, truth became criminalized, with words like war punishable by years in prison. Across the world, citizens became unwitting participants in the war's information front, choosing which stories to believe, which photos to share, which side of history to stand on. And yet, for all the chaos, the war reaffirmed something profound, that stories matter. That people respond not to statistics, but to human faces, voices, pain. That truth, even when obscured, has a stubborn gravity. The battle for reality is far from over, it may never be. But in Ukraine's courage to tell its story, and in the world's willingness to listen, there flickered a hope that even amid the noise, meaning could still emerge. Part 25, Cultural Identity and Historical Memory. Whose past is it, anyway? In Eastern Europe, history does not sit quietly in museums. It breathes, argues, and haunts. Streets are named after past battles, statues embody generations of contested memory, and cemeteries serve not only as resting places but as battlegrounds for national narratives. Nowhere is this more evident than in Ukraine, where cultural identity has long been a canvas for others to paint upon, a mosaic repeatedly shattered and rearranged, not by chance, but by force. Ukraine's national identity has always wrestled with paradox. It is a land that gave birth to Kievan Rus, a cradle of Orthodox Christianity, yet has been alternately claimed, denied, and divided by competing empires, Polish, Lithuanian, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Soviet. Its borders shifted with treaties and invasions, but its people carried the stories of Cossack revolts, Holodomor sorrow, and Maidan dreams like sacred heirlooms. In this land, to remember is an act of defiance. As the war with Russia escalated, the question of cultural identity became a front line in itself. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? Is it language? Faith? Soil? Memory? For centuries, Russian imperial and Soviet narratives had painted Ukraine not as a distinct nation, but as Little Russia, a wayward sibling destined to return home. This version of history, repeated in textbooks, literature, and state doctrine, attempted to smother the idea of a sovereign Ukrainian consciousness beneath layers of nostalgia and paternalism. But identity, when suppressed, does not vanish. It waits, underground, like a seed. And when the tanks rolled into Ukraine in 2022, they did not merely meet resistance in the form of soldiers, they met a society galvanized by a fierce, self-aware historical memory. Ukrainians tore down Soviet-era monuments, replaced Russian street names, reclaimed their folklore, revived their language. They sang songs banned a generation before. They told their own stories, loudly and publicly, declaring that their past would not be dictated by someone else's mythos. At the heart of this cultural renaissance lies the war over memory itself. Russia invokes the victory over Nazism in World War II, the Great Patriotic War, as a holy relic, using it to justify aggression and claim moral superiority. Ukraine, meanwhile, has re-examined its role in that same war, recognizing the heroism and the complicity, the victims and the collaborators, choosing to remember in full complexity rather than in sanitized legend. Memory, in Ukraine, has become multidimensional, not simply a matter of pride, but of honesty, mourning, and aspiration. Museums, films, school curricula, these are no longer neutral spaces. They are vehicles of national assertion. Ukraine's fight for identity plays out in archival research, in the revival of traditional embroidery, in the passionate debates over which historical figures deserve a place in the pantheon of national heroes. Bandera, Petlura, Shevchenko, each name evokes a different thread of belonging and struggle. Even the act of speaking Ukrainian instead of Russian has become, for many, an intimate form of resistance. And what of the places where identities overlap, where families speak both languages, where loyalties are blurred? The war has fractured many of these in-between spaces, forcing choices, deepening divisions, sometimes irrevocably. Cultural identity, once something quietly inherited, has become a matter of daily affirmation, public, visible, urgent. This struggle for historical ownership is not confined within Ukraine. Across the world, diasporas argue over terminology, maps, and historical timelines. Should Crimea be listed as part of Ukraine or Russia? What to call the Holodomor? These are not academic questions, they shape foreign policy, aid packages, and public opinion. They influence the very way history is taught to future generations. And so, the question endures, whose past is it, anyway? In Ukraine, the answer is no longer whispered. It is shouted from the barricades and whispered in lullabies. It is painted in murals and etched into broken walls. The past belongs to those who live it, carry it, question it, and refuse to surrender it. For Ukraine, memory is not a burden, it is a weapon, a shield, and a guide toward a future not written by others. Part 26, Migration and Displacement, the Human Cost of a Shifting Borderland. In the echoing footsteps of refugees and the silence of abandoned villages, the story of Ukraine's shifting borders unfolds not only on the battlefield or in political chambers, but in the bodies and memories of its people. This war, and the centuries of turmoil that preceded it, is etched into human geography. For generations, migration and forced displacement have been the bitter companions of life in this contested region. And now, once again, the borderlands bleed. As Russia's full-scale invasion tore through Ukraine in 2022, families fled not just towns and cities, but the very familiarity of their pasts. In the early months, millions poured westward, women clutching children, elderly men staring out bus windows, unsure if they would ever return. Trains became lifelines, stations temporary havens of heartbreak and hope. Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova opened their doors, while Ukrainian flags flew from balconies in Berlin and Dublin. The exodus quickly became one of the largest displacements in Europe since the Second World War. But the phenomenon of migration in this region is far older. Ukraine has long been a land between empires, a place people have fled from, been forced into, or simply drifted across in search of stability. Under Soviet rule, entire populations were uprooted. Crimean Tatars were deported en masse in 1944, packed into cattle cars and sent to Central Asia. Before that, under Stalin, peasants resisting collectivization faced death or exile. Jews escaping pogroms left behind shtetls that would later be erased by the Holocaust. Each wave of war and regime change redrew lives alongside borders. Displacement does more than scatter bodies, it fractures communities, dissolves languages, and tests the continuity of identity. In Ukraine, it has left behind a patchwork of regional dialects and divided families, each with their own geography of loss. Some left willingly, chasing opportunity abroad in the post-Soviet years. Others were coerced, manipulated, or simply swept along by the turning tides of history. Even before 2022, Ukraine was a major exporter of labor. Millions worked abroad as nurses, construction workers, engineers, often sending money home, sometimes never returning. In this way, war only exacerbated a long-running story. Inside the country, internal displacement created its own landscape of rupture. Cities like Lviv and Dnipro became shelters for those escaping the Donbas. Schools turned into dormitories. Churches handed out blankets. Every host community absorbed the trauma of strangers who were suddenly neighbors. Over time, trauma shared became trauma understood, at least in part. But not without tension, not without the exhaustion that comes when uncertainty stretches into permanence. Refugees are more than statistics. They are memories walking. A grandmother forced to flee Mariupol may carry with her the smell of the sea, a rusted key to an apartment that no longer stands, and a tattered photo of a husband buried under rubble. A child raised in Warsaw may grow up fluent in Polish but dream in Ukrainian. Across every border crossed, a question lingers: what does it mean to return, when everything you knew has changed? The long-term effects of this displacement remain unknowable, but some patterns are clear. A brain drain threatens Ukraine's recovery, as young professionals settle in Germany, Canada, or the UK. Meanwhile, villages near the front lines empty out, no one left to till the soil, to sing the old songs. At the same time, a diaspora grows ever more engaged, funding resistance, lobbying governments, teaching their children to spell Ukraine before they can read. For many, exile is not abandonment, it is a different kind of duty. And then there are the occupied zones. In Crimea, in parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, lives continue under Russian rule, with residents walking a tightrope between compliance and quiet resistance. Some chose to stay out of necessity, others because they believed in Moscow's promises. Still others were forcibly relocated, ethnic Ukrainians taken to filtration camps, children abducted into Russian institutions. The cruelty of forced assimilation is not new, but its scars are as deep as ever. To speak of displacement is to speak of loss, but also resilience. Across refugee centers, churches, Zoom calls, and border checkpoints, Ukrainians reknit the threads of their shared identity. Songs are sung in shelters. Newspapers are printed in exile. History is taught in temporary classrooms in Krakow and Vienna. In the scattered geography of the Ukrainian people, a quiet resistance endures, the refusal to let the border be the end of belonging. Part 27, Religion and the Sacred Divide, Faith as a Weapon and a Refuge. In the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, tanks and drones dominate headlines, but beneath the roar of artillery lies another battlefield, quieter yet no less profound, the realm of faith. Religion, which has long bound these two Slavic nations through common liturgy and sacred tradition, has become both a bridge and a blade, a source of solace and a tool of power. To understand the cultural and ideological fault lines of this war, one must walk through churches and monasteries, read the prayers of patriarchs, and listen to the silence left behind by shattered altars. Eastern Orthodoxy has, for centuries, served as a spiritual spine for both Russian and Ukrainian identity. Its shared roots go back to the baptism of Kievan Rus in 988, when Prince Volodymyr the Great embraced Byzantine Christianity and lit the sacred fires that would shape Eastern Slavic religious consciousness for generations. For over a millennium, that moment has stood as a spiritual origin story claimed by both nations, Kiev, as the mother of faith, Moscow, as its self-proclaimed guardian. But as the modern Ukrainian state sought to solidify its independence, the religious landscape began to fracture. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, long subordinated to the Moscow Patriarchate, began asserting autonomy. In 2018, this culminated in a historic and controversial moment when the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople granted autocephaly, independence, to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. For many Ukrainians, it was a declaration of spiritual sovereignty, a step toward reclaiming national dignity. For the Russian Orthodox Church in the Kremlin, it was a heresy, a geopolitical affront cloaked in clerical robes. Since then, religion has become deeply entwined with narratives of identity and legitimacy. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly invoked the unity of Orthodox believers to justify his vision of a Ruski Mir, a Russian world that transcends borders and binds Slavic peoples through language, heritage, and shared divine purpose. Churches, in this vision, are not merely houses of worship, they are ideological outposts. The Moscow Patriarchate, particularly under Patriarch Kirill, has lent vocal support to Russia's invasion, blessing troops and echoing Kremlin rhetoric about protecting the faithful from Western moral decay and Ukrainian schismatics. Yet for many Ukrainians, especially those under fire, religion offers not imperial justification, but refuge. Across the nation, churches have become shelters, food distribution centers, and places of mourning. Priests bless soldiers on the front lines. Chapels echo with whispered prayers for peace. In war-torn cities like Bucha and Irpin, mass graves are blessed by clergy whose faith is tested by every funeral. The cross, in these moments, is not a symbol of conquest, but of endurance. At the same time, religious diversity complicates the picture. Ukraine is home not only to Orthodox believers but to Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Jews, each with their own histories of persecution and resilience. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, with its unique blend of Eastern liturgy and allegiance to the Pope, plays a vital role in the Western regions. Jewish communities, still haunted by the shadows of the Holocaust and Soviet repression, now grapple with fresh anxieties as missiles fall near synagogues. Muslim Crimean Tatars, forcibly annexed once again, pray under occupation, their mosques monitored, their imams detained. Amid this pluralism, faith becomes a unifying force, not by erasing difference, but by dignifying suffering. Interfaith efforts have surged since 2022. Clergy of all denominations have spoken out against the war. Humanitarian convoys cross denominational lines. The sacred becomes a sanctuary not for ideology, but for humanity. Yet danger lies in the politicization of the divine. When holy texts become state manifestos, when altars become platforms for nationalism, the line between faith and fanaticism blurs. This war has seen crosses emblazoned on tanks, saints invoked for slaughter, and liturgies twisted to serve agendas. Such distortions betray the very essence of religion, a search for mercy, justice, and transcendence beyond human pride. Still, across Ukraine, candles continue to burn. Psalms are sung in bomb shelters. Mothers pray as their sons go to war. Faith, though wounded, endures, not as a banner of conquest, but as the last sanctuary of meaning in a world unraveling. Part 28, The Digital Front, Cyber Warfare, Surveillance, and the Battle for Control. The skies above Ukraine are filled with drones, but the war that matters most often plays out in silence, in code, in flickering screens behind locked doors. This is not a war waged solely on the ground or in the air, it is a battle for dominance in the invisible realm of ones and zeros. The digital front, long brewing beneath the surface of geopolitics, has erupted into a defining theater of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where information is weaponized, systems sabotaged, and control contested byte by byte. Even before the tanks rolled into Ukrainian soil in February 2022, the war had already begun in cyberspace. Ukrainian government websites were defaced, plastered with chilling warnings. Malware laced with destructive code, wipers designed not to steal, but to obliterate, began to quietly erase data from vital infrastructure. Banks, media networks, railway systems, and electricity grids all came under digital siege. It wasn't just about creating chaos, it was about instilling doubt. Who could be trusted? What was real? Where would the next breach occur? Russia, long recognized as a pioneer in offensive cyber capabilities, deployed its digital arsenal not only to dismantle networks but to blur the line between peace and war. In this twilight zone of hybrid warfare, the cyber attack became a kind of prelude, a softening blow meant to destabilize long before the missiles fell. The lessons learned in previous years, such as the infamous NotPetya attack of 2017, which originated in Ukraine and rippled across the globe, causing billions in damages, proved prescient. This was a war without borders, fought in boardrooms, server farms, and the glowing halls of command centers. Ukraine, though outmatched in resources, refused to be digitally conquered. Assisted by international allies, including a legion of ethical hackers and Silicon Valley giants, Ukraine mounted one of the most extraordinary cyber defense campaigns in modern history. Tech volunteers formed what became known as the IT Army of Ukraine, a loosely organized but highly motivated force of digital defenders who repelled attacks, exposed vulnerabilities, and launched counterstrikes. They flooded Russian websites with traffic, unmasked disinformation campaigns, and offered real-time battlefield intelligence. This was resistance, not with rifles, but with routers. But the digital front is not just about breaking systems, it is also about controlling the narrative, about who watches whom. Surveillance has become a weapon of power. Russian and Ukrainian forces both deploy facial recognition technologies to identify targets. Cell phone metadata, social media check-ins, and geolocation pings are mined for intelligence. Every camera, every keystroke, every whisper online becomes part of a vast and constantly evolving tapestry of surveillance. Civilians find themselves unwilling participants in a war that penetrates not only their towns, but their phones and their private lives. In the background, tech giants wrestle with unprecedented ethical dilemmas. Should satellite imagery be released to the public? Should facial recognition software be used to identify fallen soldiers and notify families? Can platforms remain neutral in a war where neutrality itself may be complicity? Companies like Microsoft, Google, and Starlink have found themselves acting as de facto players on the battlefield, deciding who gets to connect, who stays in the dark, who can speak, and who is silenced. At the heart of this digital conflict is a deeper question: who owns the truth? With armies of bots flooding social media, synthetic videos distorting reality, and foreign actors stoking division with algorithmic precision, the struggle for control in cyberspace is, at its core, a struggle for the minds and hearts of people far from the front lines. In such a world, victory is not always measured in territory gained or lives lost, but in belief, in perception, in what populations accept as real. And yet, amid this complexity, there remains a glimmer of hope. The war has shown the power of decentralized resistance, the agility of a connected world, and the strength of digital communities standing against tyranny. It has also raised urgent warnings that in the 21st century, no war will be purely kinetic, and no peace will be truly secure unless the digital realm is protected, transparent, and just. As drones hum in the distance and cables pulse beneath our feet, one thing is clear: this war will not be remembered solely for its battles on Earth, but for the invisible war above and beneath it, where the fate of nations is written not just in blood, but in code. Part 29, Children of the War, Youth, Trauma, and the Inheritance of Conflict. In the shadow of shattered buildings and scorched fields, it is often the smallest figures who carry the heaviest burdens. Children in war do not choose sides, yet they are shaped by its every tremor. In Ukraine, the war has left no room for innocence. Schools turned into rubble, playgrounds silenced by air raid sirens, homes reduced to ashes. This generation of youth is growing up not with lullabies, but with the distant thud of artillery echoing in their ears. And in their minds, memories form not from fairy tales, but from flight, fear, and survival. Some of these children were born just as the conflict began, their first words learned in the language of crisis. Others had already started school when the tanks came, their education interrupted by evacuation orders and internet outages. In basements lit only by the pale glow of smartphones, they finished homework, tried to celebrate birthdays, and clung to teddy bears whose threadbare eyes saw more than any child ever should. For many, the war is all they have ever known. Trauma carves deep channels in the young. Psychologists speak of toxic stress, of developing brains altered by constant danger, by the fear that any moment might be the last. Some children stop speaking. Others draw pictures of bombs and burning buildings. In refugee centers across Europe, Ukrainian children carry notebooks filled with the memories of things too terrible for words. Their games mimic the world around them: imaginary soldiers, pretend checkpoints, invisible borders they refuse to cross. Yet within this darkness, resilience flickers like a candle. Children adapt. They play with what's left. They make jokes, learn languages quickly in exile, and forge new friendships in foreign lands. Some become voices of their people, sharing their stories in classrooms, on stages, through art and music. In Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic, murals painted by young Ukrainians now brighten shelters and community centers. Each brushstroke is a defiance, a refusal to be broken. And yet, displacement always leaves a mark. Families fractured by war carry wounds that linger long after the last gun is fired. Many fathers remain on the front lines, their absence a silent void. Mothers try to hold everything together, even as their own grief threatens to pull them under. Some children lose everything: their parents, their homes, their language. Others carry secrets: the memory of a sibling lost in a missile strike, the sound of a mother's cry when the evacuation bus pulled away, the confusion of borders and bureaucracies that define their new lives. This war, like so many before it, raises an ancient and terrible question: what happens to a country when its children are raised in trauma? The answers are never simple. Some will emerge hardened, determined to rebuild. Others will struggle, their futures shaped by wounds that can't be seen on an X-ray. Entire communities will have to reckon with a generation that has grown up learning to survive, not thrive. But Ukraine is not new to survival. Its people have weathered famines, occupations, and repression. The memory of Holodomor still haunts its history, yet the nation endured. And now, as history once again presses down, the children of this war carry both the burden and the hope of tomorrow. Their lives will be the mirror in which this era is judged, not only by how fiercely their country defended itself, but by how the world chose to shelter, educate, and heal its youngest victims. To support them is to believe in the future. To listen to them is to learn what war truly means. For when the noise of battle fades and monuments are raised to the fallen, it is the quiet voices of these children that will speak the loudest truth. And in that truth may lie the seeds of peace, or the bitter inheritance of another cycle, another war, yet to come. Part 30, the front line of gender, women, resistance, and the politics of survival. In the narrative of war, the battlefield is often seen through the eyes of men in uniform. But in Ukraine, as in many conflicts throughout history, women have emerged not only as survivors but as leaders, defenders, and agents of resistance. From the early days of the conflict to the present, women have stood at the front line, not just in military fatigues, but in the kitchens feeding the displaced, in the hospitals tending to the wounded, and in the corridors of politics demanding justice, reform, and peace. In this war, Ukrainian women have been both shield and sword. While many fled with children in tow, seeking safety beyond the borders, others chose to stay. Some took up arms, trained in tactical combat, and joined the territorial defense forces. Their motivations varied: patriotism, anger, the defense of their homes, but their courage was undeniable. These were teachers, mothers, artists, accountants, now carrying rifles, leading reconnaissance missions, and guarding checkpoints. In their faces, a blend of fear and unshakable resolve; in their presence, a quiet defiance that refused to let terror rule unchallenged. But the battle lines drawn by gender extend far beyond the trenches. Women became the invisible infrastructure of resilience. As cities emptied and chaos spread, they organized aid networks, found food for the elderly, delivered medicine to the stranded, and stitched camouflage netting for soldiers at the front. In basements and church halls, they formed grassroots coalitions, some coordinating evacuations, others building shelters for women and children fleeing domestic violence that surged amid the lawlessness of war. Their fight was not only external. The war surfaced long-buried gender inequalities and injustices. Women journalists risked everything to report from active combat zones, their voices often undercredited yet crucial. Female politicians navigated threats and misogyny as they advocated for international support and documented war crimes. In courtrooms and diplomatic assemblies, they spoke on behalf of the voiceless, many of whom bore the trauma of rape, exploitation, and abuse, ancient weapons of war still wielded with terrifying regularity. The Russian invasion did not just bring tanks and missiles, it brought a resurgence of control, of ideology that viewed women not as actors in their nation's fate but as symbols to be conquered. In occupied territories, stories of gender-based violence emerged like smoke from ruined buildings, systematic, brutal, and silencing. And yet, even there, women resisted. They wrote anonymous testimonies, protected one another, and smuggled out evidence to international organizations. Their bodies were battlegrounds, but their spirits refused surrender. In exile, Ukrainian women faced new challenges. Abroad, they became heads of households, caregivers, students in foreign systems, breadwinners in unfamiliar economies. They were simultaneously applauded as resilient and burdened with impossible expectations. Many grieved in silence, their husbands lost or still fighting, their lives suspended in the purgatory of displacement. Others used their voices, speaking on international stages, forming diasporic solidarity networks, reminding the world that war does not pause for those left behind. And then there were the grandmothers, babushkas who lived through the Soviet collapse, who remembered the red stars and the silent famines. They picked up the thread of survival yet again, weaving together fractured families and feeding generations with meager means. In their stories, the echoes of other wars, other invasions, other winters of hunger and hope. What this war reveals is not only the suffering of women but the power of gendered resistance. It challenges the binary of soldier and civilian, the idea that heroism must wear camouflage or carry medals. In Ukraine, heroism wears aprons, carries children, writes policy, sings lullabies during air raids, teaches mathematics in bunkers, and dares to rebuild before the dust has settled. The politics of survival is the politics of memory, of choosing not to let loss define legacy. Ukrainian women, in all their diversity, are scripting this history with their bodies, their labor, and their dreams. Their struggle is not only for territory but for the right to shape a future where power is reimagined, where dignity is not deferred, and where survival is not a silent endurance but a fierce, feminist, and unrelenting act of resistance. Part 31, Rebuilding in the Rubble, Post-War Futures and the Price of Peace. The smoke will one day clear. The craters will fill, the roads will be paved again, and buildings will rise from the jagged outlines of destruction. But even as bricks are laid and windows replaced, the true cost of war is not so easily rebuilt. For Ukraine, the vision of a post-war future glows faint on the horizon, real, possible, but burdened by trauma, debt, and a hard-earned skepticism. What does peace look like when it arrives after years of bloodshed? Who decides its terms, and what must be sacrificed in its name? As the guns fall silent, the sounds that follow are less dramatic but no less haunting, the scrape of shovels through rubble, the hum of generators in broken towns, the quiet murmurs of families returning to homes without roofs. Rebuilding begins not with blueprints but with memory, with the need to decide what should be remembered, what must be forgiven, and what justice requires before healing can begin. Ukraine's towns and cities bear wounds more intimate than infrastructure, mass graves near playgrounds, apartment blocks shelled into grave markers, hospitals turned into morgues. Each reconstruction site is also a site of mourning. The government that survives this war will face a task as monumental as defense, rebuilding not only the physical nation but a civic trust that was bent under corruption even before the first tanks rolled in. Billions in aid and investment may flood in, but so too will opportunism. War profiteers, political factions, and foreign interests will all circle the ashes, each with their own vision for Ukraine's rebirth. And amid this, the people, many of whom fought, fled, lost, will look for leaders who can carry both hope and accountability. Justice will be an open wound. For many, peace cannot be declared until perpetrators are named, crimes acknowledged, reparations sought. War crimes trials may unfold in distant courts, but the truth must also live in villages where neighbors turned on neighbors, where families were divided by allegiance, fear, or survival. Some will demand forgiveness as a path forward, others will insist that forgetting is a betrayal. Ukraine must walk that delicate line between remembering and reliving. The economy, shattered by invasion and occupation, must rise again from scarcity. Agriculture, the breadbasket of Europe, will require reseeding not just with grain, but with trust, that farmers can harvest without fear of landmines, that exports will flow, that markets will return. Industry, too, will have to pivot from survival to innovation. There is potential for a rebirth, for green energy corridors, digital economies, new partnerships, but only if peace brings not just silence, but stability. The displaced, millions scattered across Europe and beyond, must decide whether to return. Their absence is both a loss and a question. Will a post-war Ukraine be one they recognize? One that welcomes them back with opportunity, housing, and dignity? Or will they remain in exile, rebuilding lives elsewhere, their memories of home fading into abstraction? The answer may shape not only demographics but the very identity of Ukraine for generations. And then there is the question of Russia, not only politically, but psychologically. How does a nation rebuild when its aggressor still looms on the border, still denies the narrative of the war, still threatens recurrence? Peace, in this sense, is not merely an agreement but a gamble. It requires vigilance, diplomacy, and the courage to plan a future that might again be stolen. Ukraine will need security guarantees, alliances reforged, and the world's attention not just in moments of crisis but in the long silence afterward. For children who grew up amid sirens, for artists who painted in ruins, for elders who buried both sons and dreams, rebuilding is not only about returning, but transforming. This is not a return to the Ukraine of yesterday, but the forging of one yet unimagined. A Ukraine defined not by its victimhood, but by its resilience. One where rebuilding is not just masonry, but myth-making, the crafting of a national story in which survival is not the end, but the beginning of a future owned, chosen, and fiercely protected. Part 32, Memory and Monuments, Riding the War into the Land. Long after the guns go silent and the treaties gather dust, the land remains, a canvas carved with pain, resilience, and remembrance. In Ukraine, the war has not only razed cities and fractured families but has etched itself into the soil, the skyline, the soul. As the country rebuilds, a parallel work begins, the forging of memory, the creation of monuments, and the questions that linger in granite and bronze. How will this war be remembered? Who gets to write it into stone? And what stories will the next generation inherit when they walk the streets of Mariupol or Kharkiv or Bucha? In the ruins, memory takes shape. A blown-out school wall might be preserved as a monument. A twisted tank, rusting in the sun, may become a centerpiece in a future plaza. Survivors recount the moments before the bombs fell, or the hours spent hiding in cellars, and their stories become oral testaments that will soon require a home, a museum, a statue, a plaque. But more than buildings, it is meaning that is being constructed. To remember is not simply to record, it is to interpret, to enshrine values, to declare whose suffering mattered and what it all stood for. Monuments are never neutral. A sculpture of a grieving mother may soothe some and provoke others. A memorial to resistance fighters can inspire pride or open old wounds. For Ukraine, a nation that has long lived in the crosswinds of others' empires and myths, the stakes are even higher. Will this war be remembered primarily as a story of Western alignment, of democracy versus authoritarianism? Or will it be framed in deeply national terms, as the final struggle for sovereignty and cultural survival? Each choice in memorialization is a mirror, reflecting not only the past, but the present anxieties and future ambitions of the nation. The act of remembering is also a form of resistance. Russia has long sought to overwrite Ukrainian identity, to claim Kyiv's legacy, to fold Ukraine's history into its own imperial narrative. By commemorating its pain and triumphs on its own terms, Ukraine reasserts its narrative sovereignty. Each monument raised is a declaration that the people here endured, resisted, and defined themselves. Memory, in this case, becomes geopolitical, a border drawn in thought and spirit, not just in trenches. But memory can divide as well as unite. In some towns, collaborators lived alongside resistors. In others, the lines between guilt and survival blur with each passing year. How should those stories be told? Should they be told at all? The danger is not only in forgetting but in oversimplifying, in reducing a complex human experience to a single heroic narrative. True remembrance requires space for ambiguity, for loss that had no resolution, for choices made in fear and love and desperation. Children will grow up tracing their fingers along the names engraved in black marble. They will ask what happened here, and why. Their textbooks may offer one version, their grandparents another. In between will stand the monuments, silent, stoic, partial truths in metal and stone. And so, it becomes a sacred responsibility, to ensure that what is built does not lie, that it neither sanitizes the horror nor glorifies the violence, but instead honors the humanity that persisted within it. Digital memory, too, plays a role. Virtual museums, augmented reality tours, archived footage, all of it will allow future generations to step into the past without leaving their screens. But the danger of digital remembrance is detachment. A monument made of pixels cannot replace one touched by rain and age and human presence. The physical matters, because grief, like memory, demands a place to return to. And so, across Ukraine, memory will rise with the buildings. Statues will emerge where bombs once fell. Names will be whispered in museums and shouted in classrooms. In cemeteries, old and new, flowers will be laid with trembling hands. It is here, in this act of riding the war into the land, that Ukraine will complete the final battle, not just to survive, but to be remembered rightly. Part 33, Justice and Reckoning, Trials, Truth Commissions, and the Long Road to Accountability. When the bombs stop falling and the soldiers retreat, the silence that follows is not peace. It is the beginning of another kind of battle, one waged in courtrooms, in archives, in the raw testimonies of those who survived and the meticulous documents left behind by those who orchestrated. For Ukraine, the path to justice in the aftermath of invasion and occupation is not merely legal, it is existential. The war has not only shattered buildings and families, it has ruptured the very framework of what it means to live in a lawful, moral world. And in that vacuum, justice must rise. Across cities once under siege, investigators sift through the debris. They count bodies, collect bullet casings, log the serial numbers on fragments of rockets. Drones fly over mass graves. Witnesses sit in dimly lit rooms and describe what cannot be forgotten: neighbors turned enemies, children burned in basements, convoys of soldiers with no insignias. Each detail is a thread in the vast, knotted tapestry of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts that some dare to call genocide. But even naming these horrors is a process of negotiation, of definition, of political and moral courage. At the international level, there are precedents. From Nuremberg to The Hague, the world has occasionally attempted to reckon with atrocity. But these moments are rare, fraught with power imbalances and diplomatic roadblocks. The question is not just whether justice will be pursued, but whether it will be allowed. Will the perpetrators be named if they sit in powerful offices in Moscow? Will the global appetite for accountability endure when it collides with the practical need for energy deals, security alliances, and diplomatic pragmatism? Inside Ukraine, efforts unfold with urgency and quiet determination. The Prosecutor General's office catalogs thousands of cases, from stolen grain to sexual violence. Ukrainian judges prepare for trials that may take years, even decades. But the sheer scale of alleged crimes, committed across thousands of miles, involving thousands of actors, makes the task almost overwhelming. Justice, in this context, is not a single verdict or televised trial. It is a long, uneven road marked by bureaucracy, trauma, and the competing demands of healing and punishment. Truth commissions may follow, forums where survivors speak, where the silences of war are given voice. These are not only judicial acts, but moral ones. They allow a society to confront its own reflection, to understand the complexity of its suffering, to grapple with the complicity of some and the victimhood of others. In the process, wounds reopen, but they also begin to clean. Without truth, reconciliation is impossible. But truth, especially in a landscape littered with propaganda and disinformation, is fragile. It must be protected, curated, defended. Justice must also stretch beyond courtrooms. It lives in the policies that support survivors, in reparations that rebuild homes and lives, in the way children are taught history. It is felt in whether refugees are welcomed home, whether war widows receive pensions, whether soldiers with missing limbs are seen as heroes or burdens. The moral ledger of a nation cannot be balanced in law alone, it must be carried in daily life, in how people treat one another in the aftermath. And there is the deeper question: will justice be just? Trials can become theater. Truth commissions can be manipulated. International bodies can fail. What then? Ukraine, like many countries before it, faces a paradox: to believe in justice even when it is delayed, to pursue it even when the odds are long, to insist that truth matters in a world increasingly indifferent to it. Justice, in this way, is not a destination but a direction, toward dignity, accountability, and memory. In the end, the long road to accountability is not only about the perpetrators. It is about the victims, the survivors, the nation itself. It is about whether the horrors inflicted will be buried or illuminated. Whether the silence of mass graves will speak through verdicts and stories and reparations. Whether Ukraine will emerge from this war not just free, but more just. That is the real reckoning, a future where justice does not merely punish, but heals. Part 34, Reconciliation or Revenge, the Fragile Politics of Peace. Peace is often imagined as a moment, the signing of a treaty, the lowering of weapons, the homecoming of soldiers. But true peace, lasting peace, is a process, a fragile, painful unfolding of decisions that must be made not just with the mind, but with the soul of a wounded nation. In the shadow of war, Ukraine stands at such a threshold, staring into the ambiguity of its own future. The question is not only how to end the war, but how to end the hatred, the bitterness, the deep fractures left behind by violence. It is a question of reconciliation, or revenge. After all the bloodshed, the displacement, the massacres, and the burned-out cities, the instinct for retribution is natural. The need to see those responsible punished, humiliated, erased from power, that impulse surges in every scarred family and every memorial candle. But peace forged in vengeance is brittle. It hardens borders, deepens divisions, and plants the seeds of future violence. The more durable path, reconciliation, is much harder. It asks for patience, empathy, restraint, and an almost unimaginable forgiveness. It demands a society look not just at the enemy across the border, but inward, at what it must unlearn, what it must rebuild. Yet how can one speak of reconciliation while tanks still roll and sirens still wail in the night? The wounds are fresh. Entire regions have been razed. Children have grown old in the space of a single year. There are no easy models to follow. South Africa, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, each offers lessons, but also warnings. Peace built without justice becomes capitulation. But justice without compassion can become a different kind of violence, one that may wear the robes of righteousness yet leaves no room for healing. In Ukraine, the politics of peace are already forming. Whispers of post-war settlements echo through embassies and summits. Questions swirl: will Russia ever withdraw fully? Will occupied territories be restored? What compromises, if any, can be made without betraying the dead? And what of the people who lived under occupation, those who collaborated, those who survived in silence, those who resisted in the shadows? Forgiveness, in such cases, becomes a test of national character. How does one hold space for both accountability and mercy? Political leaders will struggle to balance outrage with realism. Domestic pressures, grieving mothers, radicalized veterans, entire towns that no longer exist, will clash with international pressures urging calm, trade, diplomacy. Foreign powers will push their own agendas. Aid will be tied to conditions. The media will frame every gesture either as betrayal or bravery. And through it all, the Ukrainian people will have to decide what kind of nation they wish to become in the aftermath, not only victorious, but also morally whole. At the same time, peace will not be symmetrical. Even if a ceasefire is signed, even if borders are redrawn, reconciliation requires both sides to participate. But what if one side remains aggressive, belligerent, trapped in denial? What if the state that started the war continues to deny its crimes, to glorify its invasion, to raise the next generation on lies? In such a scenario, reconciliation becomes not a two-way street, but a path Ukraine must walk alone, for its own future, not its enemy's absolution. Grassroots movements may lead the way where governments falter. Communities, churches, schools, and veterans groups may become the quiet architects of reconciliation, not through grand declarations, but through daily acts of coexistence, through art, through remembrance, through replanting what was once destroyed. In these small, stubborn acts, peace begins to take root, not as erasure of the past, but as a refusal to be consumed by it. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of a choice. Ukraine, like many before it, must now choose: will it let the pain of war calcify into cycles of revenge? Or will it, despite everything, choose to reach for something braver, harder, and infinitely more human? Part 35. Global Ripples: How the Ukraine War Reshaped the World. When the first Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border in February 2022, few could have predicted just how far the shockwaves would reach. At first, it was a regional crisis, an old imperial ambition reignited, an echo of 20th-century power politics. But like a stone hurled into still water, the war's ripples spread swiftly, touching every continent, every market, every ideology. It was not merely a conflict between two neighboring states, it was a rupture in the global order, a moment when assumptions cracked and the future became something wholly uncertain. In Europe, the war revived fears many thought long buried. For the first time since the Cold War, NATO found itself not only relevant but essential. Troop deployments surged eastward. Finland and Sweden, long neutral, sought the protective embrace of alliance. Energy markets were thrown into turmoil as Europe scrambled to break its dependence on Russian gas. In cities from Berlin to Warsaw, old Cold War anxieties flickered back to life, and with them came a rearmament not just of weapons, but of will. The economic aftershocks rippled far beyond the battlefield. As grain shipments from Ukraine stalled, food prices soared from Cairo to Jakarta. Fragile supply chains, already strained by the pandemic, snapped under the weight of new sanctions and trade disruptions. Inflation tightened its grip globally. Developing nations, caught in the crossfire of economic titans, found themselves paying the price for a war not of their making. For many, the conflict became a grim reminder that globalization had never been as frictionless or equitable as once promised. The war also fractured the illusion of a single, unified world order. While much of the West rallied behind Ukraine, condemning the invasion and supplying weapons and aid, other powers saw opportunity. China watched closely, gauging the limits of Western resolve. India walked a delicate tightrope, maintaining ties with both Russia and the West. African and Latin American nations, scarred by their own histories of imperialism, hesitated to embrace what some saw as a selective morality, condemning some aggressors while ignoring others. The war revealed not only geopolitical divides, but also moral ones. And in the realm of information, the conflict rewrote the rules. Social media became both a battlefield and a lifeline, used to document atrocities, rally support, and wage psychological war. TikToks of tanks, memes of resistance, live streams from bomb shelters, it was a war experienced in real time by a connected, watching world. Yet it also exposed how truth itself could be fractured, manipulated, weaponized. Deepfakes, bot campaigns, state-sponsored narratives, what people believed often depended less on evidence and more on the echo chambers they inhabited. The refugee crisis added another layer to the war's global imprint. Millions of Ukrainians fled their homes, finding shelter in Poland, Germany, the United States, and beyond. The warmth of their reception, in stark contrast to refugees from other wars and regions, forced many societies to confront uncomfortable questions about race, religion, and selective compassion. It also reignited debates about borders, migration, and the responsibilities of wealthier nations in times of global crisis. Perhaps most profoundly, the war challenged assumptions about democracy, sovereignty, and the endurance of the liberal world order. In Ukraine's defiance, many in the West rediscovered a sense of moral clarity long thought eroded by decades of cynicism and compromise. But in that same defiance, authoritarian regimes saw a threat, proof that even battered democracies could resist and endure. The battle lines were not just territorial, but ideological. And so, as the war dragged on, its impact became less about missiles and more about meaning. What kind of world would rise from its ashes? One where might makes right, or one where rights are worth fighting for? Would it hasten the end of an American-led order, or rekindle its purpose? Would it deepen divisions or inspire unity? The answers remain unwritten. But the ripples continue, reaching distant shores, reshaping alliances, reordering economies, and reminding a distracted world that the fate of one nation can still bend the arc of history. Part 36, War in the Environment, the Ecological Toll of Conflict. Long after the echoes of artillery fade and treaties are signed, the earth remembers. Beneath the scorched soil, along shattered riverbanks, and across forests torn by tank treads, war leaves its mark, not just on people and politics, but on the land itself. The war in Ukraine, like so many before it, has not only redrawn borders and changed lives, but also wounded the environment in ways that may take generations to heal, if ever. Ukraine is a country of vast, fertile plains, dense woodlands, and critical waterways. Its black soil, Chernobyl, is among the richest in the world, long prized for its agricultural bounty. But in the path of conflict, that richness has been turned into ruin. Shelling has cratered once productive farmland. Fields of wheat, sunflower, and barley, symbols of Ukraine's economic life and national pride, have been abandoned, mined, or burned. In some regions, crops have become casualties, either too dangerous to harvest or destroyed outright by military action. The war, unfolding in one of the world's major breadbaskets, has not only created immediate food insecurity but may have contaminated the very land needed to recover from it. Industrial sites have become flashpoints for environmental catastrophe. Explosions at chemical plants, oil depots, and factories have released toxic plumes into the sky and carcinogenic runoff into the rivers. The shelling of pipelines and refineries has not just disrupted fuel supply but spilled thousands of tons of hazardous materials into the soil and groundwater. Fires, unchecked in war zones, rage through protected woodlands and reserves, reducing ecosystems to ash. Wildlife, caught between front lines, either flees or perishes in silence, victims of a war not made for them. One of the greatest fears early in the conflict centered on Ukraine's nuclear facilities, most notably, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. It became the surreal site of military standoffs, with artillery exchanges occurring dangerously close to spent fuel storage and active reactors. International observers warned of a potential meltdown or radioactive leak, recalling the ghost of Chernobyl and the enduring trauma it carved into Ukraine's national psyche. Even without a major nuclear disaster, the mere threat of such an event underscored the immense environmental risks modern war now entails. Then there is water. Rivers like the Dnipro, which sustain cities and agriculture alike, have been weaponized. Dams have been bombed, flooded villages washed away in minutes, and entire ecosystems transformed overnight. Water treatment plants, compromised or destroyed, have led to contamination and disease, further burdening civilian populations. Lakes and wetlands, once teeming with life, now reflect the smoke-blackened sky, their silence a testament to the environmental toll of violence. And yet, these impacts extend beyond borders. Air pollution from burning oil depots and exploding ammunition does not stop at checkpoints. Contaminated rivers flow into seas shared with other nations. The greenhouse gases emitted by military machinery, jets, tanks, trucks, contribute to a global climate crisis that cares little for alliances or enmities. The war in Ukraine is not simply a national tragedy, it is an environmental one that echoes across continents and decades. In the rush to document human suffering, and rightly so, this quieter crisis often remains unseen. Yet it is no less dire. Long after the soldiers go home, the forests will remain littered with unexploded ordnance. Children will grow up near poison streams. The biodiversity of the region, already strained, may never fully recover. And reconstruction, no matter how ambitious, cannot bring back what was lost in fire and steel. Still, amid devastation, there are glimmers of resilience. Environmental groups, even in wartime, continue to monitor, to plant, to plan. International organizations are preparing for a future of ecological restoration. Some hope that, in the rebuilding, there might be room for rewilding, for renewal, for a Ukraine not just free and sovereign, but greener and stronger than before. But the scars will remain. War is not only a human tragedy, it is an assault on the earth itself. And if we are to understand its full cost, we must look not just to the headlines and casualty reports, but also to the forests gone quiet, the rivers turned black, and the soil that remembers. Part 37, Drones, Satellites, and the Changing Face of Modern Warfare. In the skies above Ukraine, a new kind of war unfolds, one not defined solely by trenches or tanks, but by the whirring of rotors, the silent orbit of satellites, and the cold logic of code. Here, on a battlefield where 20th century tactics meet 21st century tools, the traditional image of the soldier has been joined by engineers, programmers, and technicians. In this war, the dominant terrain is no longer just the ground beneath one's boots, but the invisible space above and the digital realm within. From the earliest days of the conflict, it became clear that drones, small, unmanned aerial vehicles, would play a transformative role. What began as a few off-the-shelf quadcopters used for reconnaissance quickly evolved into a highly organized and strategic use of drone warfare. Civilian drones adapted with thermal cameras began identifying enemy movements at night. Modified to carry explosives, some drones became cheap, terrifyingly precise assassins, hovering silently before dropping their payload on tanks or dugouts. Others were simply eyes in the sky, giving commanders live feeds of enemy maneuvers in real time. It was not just Ukraine's use of drones that signaled the shift. Russia deployed its own fleets, many imported or supported by foreign allies like Iran. The Iranian-made Shahid drones, loitering munitions with the eerie hum of a motorbike, became symbols of dread as they buzzed over cities and infrastructure. Their job was often psychological as much as physical, undermining morale with the threat of unpredictable strikes. In this arms race of automation, both sides scrambled to jam, spoof, or shoot down each other's drones, sparking a new kind of aerial chess. Above even the drone battles loomed the satellites, silent, tireless observers. For Ukraine, Western commercial and military satellite support became vital. Real-time satellite imagery allowed Ukrainian forces to spot buildups, track logistics, and verify intelligence with a clarity no previous war had afforded. Civilian tech companies, from SpaceX's Starlink providing secure battlefield internet to Earth observation firms delivering high-resolution maps, blurred the line between commercial service and military asset. In this conflict, a company in California could make decisions that affected the fate of soldiers in Kherson. This spaceborne connectivity was more than a tactical advantage, it was a revolution in command and control. Units scattered across terrain could coordinate with unprecedented speed. Artillery could be guided not just by local spotters but by images from low Earth orbit. Logistics, always the backbone of any military operation, became more efficient through real-time data sharing, even as supply lines remained under fire. Yet, this evolution came with vulnerabilities. The more dependent both sides became on these technologies, the more tempting they became as targets. Cyber attacks on satellite networks, GPS spoofing, and electromagnetic warfare turned the digital domain into its own battlefield. Communications could be hijacked, networks jammed, or feeds disrupted. And with each leap forward, the war's complexity deepened, as did the potential for mistakes or miscalculations with far-reaching consequences. For the soldiers and civilians on the ground, the effect was palpable. No longer could one move under cover of night or trust a building was safe simply because it looked intact. A lone drone overhead might carry nothing, or it might carry death. An internet outage might be a technical glitch, or the prelude to an assault. The war had become a theater of constant surveillance, where visibility equaled vulnerability, and knowledge was as potent a weapon as any missile. This transformation is not unique to Ukraine. What is being tested here, through fire and innovation, is the future of warfare. Armies across the globe are watching closely, updating doctrines, designing new tools, and learning that the next war may be won not just with force, but with faster code, better optics, and more agile machines. Ukraine has become not only a battleground for sovereignty but a proving ground for technologies that will shape conflict in decades to come. As the war evolves, so too does its shape. And in the electric hum of drones, the flicker of satellite feeds, and the silent coding of digital warriors, one truth becomes clear: the face of war has changed. It wears no uniform, it walks on no ground, and it may already be above us, watching. Part 38, Foreign Fighters and the Internationalization of the Conflict. Long before governments formally weighed in, before sanctions hardened and alliances drew fresh lines across the globe, the war in Ukraine had already become international in spirit. It wasn't just a matter of politics or policy, it was a matter of people. As the first tanks crossed Ukraine's borders in February 2022, men and women from far beyond Eastern Europe began packing their bags. Some were veterans. Some were idealists. Some were adventurers. All were drawn into a war that, though rooted in the soil of one nation, resonated like a drumbeat across continents. From Georgia to Canada, from the United Kingdom to Colombia, volunteers streamed in to answer President Zelensky's call to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. They came under many flags and none, joining what became known as the International Legion. For some, the call was ideological, a defense of democracy against authoritarianism, a modern echo of the Spanish Civil War's international brigades. For others, it was personal, family ties, ancestral lands, a desire to make history rather than merely observe it. Among them were combat-hardened soldiers who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other theaters. They brought experience, tactics, and the kind of calm under fire that only battle could teach. Others were novices, idealists with perhaps more courage than preparation, who soon discovered that war, no matter how noble the cause, is always an ugly teacher. Some stayed, adapting to the rhythms of Ukrainian defense. Others left, disillusioned or wounded or simply overwhelmed by the brutal pace of the fighting. On the other side, too, the war attracted outsiders. Reports emerged of Russian-backed separatist units hosting Serbian volunteers, far-right ideologues, and mercenaries from various corners of the post-Soviet world. More officially, Russia's reliance on Wagner Group, a private military company with deep ties to the Kremlin, signaled how modern conflict could blur the lines between state armies and for-hire warriors. In time, Wagner fighters would be joined by others from Syria and Africa, some motivated by money, others by Russia's shadowy geopolitical alliances. This influx of foreign fighters complicated the already tangled web of the war. Language barriers, varied training levels, and differing motivations created both opportunities and chaos. But more than anything, it symbolized something deeper, the emotional reach of the conflict. It wasn't just Ukraine's fight anymore. It had become a proxy battleground for global anxieties, where lines between East and West, freedom and control, history and future were being drawn not only by diplomats but by volunteers carrying rifles. But the internationalization didn't end with individuals. Nations, too, were pulled in, not always with soldiers, but with weapons, intelligence, and influence. American Javelin missiles, British NLAWs, and Turkish Bayraktar drones soon became as familiar on the front lines as Ukrainian-made Kalashnikovs. Western military advisors, though often officially absent, were quietly involved in training and strategic support. Meanwhile, Russian forces drew on Iranian drones and North Korean munitions, widening the scope of suppliers involved in the carnage. This flow of material and manpower gave the conflict a momentum and resilience that surprised many. Ukraine, thought by some to be overrun in days, held firm. Not just because of its own courage, but because it had become a symbol, a rallying point for a world increasingly uneasy with aggression and autocracy. Russia, too, found support in corners of the world where anti-Western sentiment ran high, or where economic ties outweighed political reservations. Yet the growing list of participants also magnified the risks. Every foreign volunteer wounded, every foreign-made missile fired, every border crossed by supplies raised the stakes. It raised the possibility of escalation, of miscalculation, of wider war. It forced the world to walk a tightrope, supporting a cause without slipping into catastrophe. Still, the human stories of these international fighters endure. Some died far from home, buried in unfamiliar soil but remembered as heroes by strangers. Others returned, changed in ways no one back home could fully understand. Their presence, like the war itself, became a reflection of a deeper truth, that the conflict was never only about Ukraine. It was about the world's vision of itself, of sovereignty, solidarity, and survival. As the war dragged on, the front lines hardened, but the sense of isolation faded. Ukraine was not alone. It had become the heart of a global reckoning, a place where the world had come not just to watch, but to stand. Part 39, Learning from the Past, History's Echoes in Today's War. In the eerie silence that sometimes falls between shellfire, when the dust hangs thick and the air is heavy with the scent of churned earth, there are moments when history seems to whisper. Ukraine's war is not fought in a vacuum, and it does not speak in isolation. Every shattered building in Mariupol, every refugee train heading west, every flag hoisted over reclaimed territory draws not only on the events of recent months but on a legacy etched into the soil over centuries. The past does not sleep here, it walks alongside the present, sometimes as a guide, sometimes as a ghost. To understand today's war is to remember others, wars where borders bled and empires flexed. It is to remember the partitions of Poland, where Ukraine was carved and traded. It is to remember the Holodomor, when a man-made famine turned fields of grain into mass graves. It is to remember the Second World War, when Ukraine was the battleground for two totalitarian titans and the burial site for millions. In that bloody history, one sees the echoes of today, civilian suffering, ideological fervor, and the cruel logic of strategic depth. The Soviet memory looms large. For Russia, the Great Patriotic War was not only a victory, it was a baptism of fire that forged national pride. That memory, sacred and often unquestioned, is used to frame modern-day military ventures as extensions of the same sacred mission. When Russian leaders invoke denazification as a pretext, they draw upon that deep reservoir of historical trauma, even if the analogies stretch truth past breaking. And in doing so, they reveal how history can be weaponized, not as a source of wisdom, but as a tool of justification. Yet Ukraine's memory is more fractured, more complex. For decades, its history was written by others, by Tsars, by Soviets, by foreign scholars with foreign maps. But with independence came the right to remember on their own terms. The narrative of national resistance, of Cossack freedom, of cultural survival amidst imperial pressures has risen to the forefront. Museums, memorials, and schoolbooks have been reshaped to reflect a Ukrainian voice, often one that stands in quiet defiance of the Russian one. The conflict today is not just a war of weapons, but a war of remembrance. Whose version of the past will prevail? Who gets to define what happened and what it meant? Monuments have become battlegrounds. Statues are toppled not merely for what they represent, but for the memory they enshrine. Cities rename their streets. Textbooks are rewritten. In the process, identity hardens. A generation grows up not only in the rubble of war, but in the architecture of memory built around them. There is also the question of Europe's history, of the West's role. The wars of the 20th century taught bitter lessons about appeasement, sovereignty, and the price of ignoring aggression. Those lessons reverberated as tanks rolled across the Ukrainian steppe. For some nations, it was déjà vu, for the Baltic states, for Poland, for Finland. For others, it was a reckoning delayed too long. Europe's response, uneven at first, began to gather coherence. It was not just about Ukraine. It was about the credibility of the post-war order, the promise of never again, tested once more. Meanwhile, the global South looked on with different eyes. For many in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Western calls for moral clarity rang hollow, shaped by colonial legacies and selective outrage. These regions remember their own pasts, of exploitation, of proxy wars, of being footnotes in someone else's great game. In the Ukraine war, they saw not just a local tragedy, but a reflection of global imbalance, and they responded with nuance, caution, sometimes silence. Still, amid these overlapping histories, there is a yearning, for learning, for not repeating. Veterans of older wars counsel restraint. Survivors of past displacements share stories that guide new ones. Academics trace patterns and publish warnings. And always, the past hovers, not as a script, but as a set of possibilities. What we learn from it, what we choose to carry forward or to abandon, shapes what comes next. History teaches, yes. But only if we are willing to listen beyond slogans, beyond monuments, beyond the neat stories that simplify what was once chaos. It teaches us that wars start with certainty and end in questions. That memory is power. That forgetting can be fatal. In Ukraine today, history is not past. It is present. It is alive in every decision, every alliance, every tear. Whether it will guide toward peace or drag the world deeper into conflict, that remains to be written. Part 40, the final chapter? Charting the course beyond war. In the quiet hours that follow the thunder of conflict, when smoke clears and cities begin to count their scars, a new kind of battle begins, a slower, less visible struggle to rebuild what was broken, to make meaning of the suffering, and to choose a path that does not simply circle back to war. Ukraine, like many nations before it, now stands at this uncertain threshold, a nation bleeding and brave, wondering what comes next. And beyond its borders, the world watches, not merely out of sympathy, but because the future of this war holds implications for us all. War has a way of burning away illusions. In its aftermath, the hard questions cannot be avoided. How does a country heal when a generation has grown up knowing only air raid sirens and exile? How does it reintegrate regions torn by occupation or seduced by false promises? How does it write a future that includes both justice for victims and space for reconciliation? These are the questions that will define not only Ukraine's future, but the character of the international order that claims to value peace. the first steps beyond war are often the most treacherous. Victory, if it comes, does not guarantee unity. Ceasefires do not ensure peace. And fatigue, both within Ukraine and abroad, can sap the will to finish the work that war demands in its aftermath. There will be pressure to move on, to forget, to compromise for the sake of stability. But true peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of fairness, dignity, and trust. These must be built intentionally, brick by brick, amid rubble. The international community, too, has a role. For decades, it has spoken the language of human rights and sovereignty, yet often acted with selective urgency. If it is to have any moral authority, it must walk with Ukraine beyond this war, supporting reconstruction, justice, and long-term security guarantees that prevent a return to the cycle of betrayal and abandonment. Aid must not be conditional on political convenience. Commitments must outlast headlines. And what of Russia? A post-war future must grapple with the uncomfortable truth that peace cannot be imposed on top of unresolved identity. The Russian people, many of whom have been fed state propaganda for years, will need time and space to reckon with their own national narrative. Demonization helps no one. Accountability is vital, but so is an eventual reintegration of truth, memory, and shared humanity. History teaches that punishment without pathways to healing rarely results in lasting peace. Yet for all the uncertainty, there is hope. Not the easy, naive kind, but the fierce hope born of survival. In cities where streets were once battlefields, children return to school. Artists paint again. Farmers plant sunflowers in craters. Refugees write poems in languages not their own. Each act, no matter how small, defies the logic of war and stakes a claim in the promise of tomorrow. Perhaps the final chapter is not final at all. Perhaps it is the beginning of something new, if we have the courage to learn from what has come before. The war in Ukraine has tested the resilience of nations, the patience of people, and the strength of ideals. But it has also revealed the enduring human desire for freedom, for home, for meaning. Those are powerful forces. Stronger, perhaps, than any bomb or bullet. And so, we end not with certainty, but with possibility. A crossroads, not a conclusion. The world that emerges from this war will be shaped by the choices made now, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in the hearts of leaders and ordinary citizens alike. The future is not written. It is waiting, fragile and fierce, in the hands of those who dare to imagine peace not just as a dream, but as a discipline. This, then, is our charge, to listen, to learn, and to choose the path forward with clear eyes and steady hands. The final chapter is not about endings. It is about the world we still have time to create,